Yeah, okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. Good morning. Fáilte roimh go léir chuig scoil róna lí chonneil agus mo bhuíochas Steve go léir chun bheith asachta hen seo. In true South Kerry tradition, despite my insistence on keeping to the timetable, it's important for chair people and Dini Moorla to break the rules. So we're 10 minutes late. But anyway, I hope our friends online won't mind that. But anyway, I'd like to welcome you all to the 10th annual presentation of the Daniel O'Connell School. Now, for those of you with a keen eye, you'll know that we're 10 years on the go. But of course, we only met 9 times because of COVID. So we're 10 years young and 9 years on the go, if you can put it that way. So anyway, I'd like to welcome, I see some people in the audience here. I was going to say in the congregation, but anyway, I hope there won't be any collection afterwards, that's okay. But I see some people here who have been attending for the last 10 years, and we are grateful for their support. I'd also like to welcome those who are here for the first time. We hope you enjoy yourself. The people of the town are friendly. And like talking, as you'll soon find out, if you haven't already. So we welcome you. And of course, the people from the locality, from Ivara, really, who drive this school in all different kinds of ways. So welcome, everybody. I'd also like to welcome those who are following our proceedings online, particularly our faithful, is it 2 or 3 friends out in New Zealand? So good morning or good afternoon or good night, whatever time it is in New Zealand. So welcome to you all. Now, again, as I said, because these proceedings are taking place online, we will try and keep to the timetable. But of course, in true Kerry tradition, as I said, I've started by breaking my own rule, but we will try and make up for it during the course of the day. And I should say as well that those of you who want to look at the lecture in the O'Connell Memorial Church, the one I'm giving myself, just to know that that can't be accessed through the website of the school, that you have to go into the church services, the website of the church itself, which is no big deal. You know, you just simply type in Daniel O'Connell Memorial Church, you'll get the website of the church up, and you can access the lecture there. There's no charge or anything like that. The other thing is that in the brochure, it says that we will provide a bus to take people up to the church. Unfortunately, we can't do that because the church is required to ferry people from school, and they won't be back in time. But if anybody in the audience needs a lift, if you just let our front desk know, I mean, it's not too far anyway. I'm not asking people to walk, but it's about a 20-minute walk for those of you who are fit or disposed towards walking, which I'm afraid I'm not. But anyway, anybody who needs a lift, it's no big deal. We can certainly provide that. So I don't think there are any other housekeeping. Oh yes, there's one other addition to the program, and that is that we will be reconvening at 1:45 rather than at 2, because we will be not launching, but recognizing a book that was written by a lady who has strong connections with Kells, I think is the best way of putting it. Absolutely, she's down there in the back. And her aunt was Eamon Langford's wife, which is the easiest way of introducing her, I think, because Eamon Langford was much loved by us all, and of course was a great supporter of the O'Connell School when it was established in 2013. So again, we'll be meeting at 1:45, and as I said, trying to stick to the timetable as much as we can. So that brings me now to introduce our first guest. We have to switch around the program and introduce the minister first, because she has an important appointment in Dublin this afternoon. I might say, Minister, that about 2 weeks ago, I got a phone call from your office, and there was a lady called Anna Sullivan. I hope she won't mind me mentioning her name. Every office, by the way, should have an Anna Sullivan. But anyway, Anna Sullivan rang me to say, she said, Mara, she said, this thing about the minister coming to Cahirsiveen, and my heart immediately sank. I said, oh God, don't tell me she's not coming. But like any good assistant, and anybody, I suppose, who's any good at dealing with politics or with the public, she had a problem, but she had the solution. She made me wait a little bit for it, but she had the solution. And the solution was that instead of arriving at 10:30, could the minister possibly arrive at 9:30? I said that was no problem. So we're very grateful, because I know this has come at some inconvenience to you, Minister, because of your appointment in Dublin this afternoon. So we're grateful that you took, I know Tralee is up the road, but it's still 40 miles to come up and down, so we're grateful. So it's a bit, I was trying to figure out how I would introduce Minister Foley, and I said to myself, it's very presumptuous of me to be introducing her to her own constituents, you know, because she's well known here. But in any way, just for the record, you know that she was elected in 2019 or 20? And she was appointed Minister for Education once the government was formed. But crucially, at least I can say this, but in a few editorial comments, crucially, before she became a minister, of course, she taught for a number of years in Pres in Tralee, so she knows a little bit about education and did it before she was ever appointed minister. But and also crucially, she cut her teeth in local government. And I must say, it always shows, you know, the politicians who spend their time in local government, in her case, in the UDC in Tralee and Kerry County Council. I think they bring, this is my own perspective now, by the way, not a political point, but they bring a perspective to bear, I think, on the tasks ahead, which maybe others don't. Personal opinion. But it's my way of introducing Norma Foley, not just as our deputy, but as somebody that we've known for a long time, and we greatly appreciate, as I said, the trouble and the time that she took to be here, and we thank her, and Anna Sullivan. Thank you very much.
Díomh go léir is an ormhór domsa mar ara I dachas fehansa, agus bhála mar dús, má bhuiachas a gháil as ochtan cura, agus as ochtan ama, agus an deisio ó thuairtam chun búla liv agus chun leabhart liv inniuh. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great honour for me as Minister for Education, but most especially as a Kerry woman, to be here this morning and join you for this, the Daniel O'Connell School 2023. This morning, I intend to speak to you on the theme of Education 2023, its challenges, but also its many opportunities. However, before I get to the task at hand, I'm conscious that right throughout these coming days, everyone will have an opportunity to share and discuss their favourite story, their favourite anecdote, their favourite insight into Daniel O'Connell. And I'm going to start the ball rolling this morning by sharing with you my own personal anecdote or story, if you like, about Daniel O'Connell. And I like it because it is a story that illustrates his razor-sharp wit and his mastery of communication. And also because I believe within it, there is a very significant and salutary lesson for anyone in the world of politics. I believe, in fact, it was probably a story that was shared here previously also on another occasion by Professor John Horgan. But I'm a firm believer, and I would always say this to my own students, if it's a good story to tell the first time, it's a good story to tell the second time. So anyway, the story concerns O'Connell, and it's to do with a confrontation that he had with a reporter from the London Times concerning an erroneous account of one of his speeches in the House of Commons. The reporter apologised, saying that it had been hard to hear O'Connell from the press gallery, and also that his notes had been partly obliterated by a shower of rain on the way back to the newspaper office. Now, O'Connell told him, and I quote him directly here, O'Connell said, "That was the most extraordinary shower of rain I ever heard of, for it not only washed out the speech I made from your notebook, but washed in another and entirely different one in its place." Caustic, but very sharp. And I often wonder, you know, what O'Connell would make of the world in which we live today in terms of Twitter or X and Instagram and Facebook and all of that, but no doubt he would be equally as caustic and equally as relevant. But perhaps that's a topic for another session of an O'Connell School into the future. So anyway, what I do know about O'Connell really is that as one of the most influential figures in Irish history, Daniel O'Connell not only championed the cause of Irish independence, but also recognised the vital role of education as a means to empower individuals and unite and shape our progress as a nation. The right to education is enshrined both in our Constitution and in international law. This is a fundamental right, which underpins all that the government and school system do to support almost 1 million children and young people in our 4,000 schools every single day. This right underpins our vision, a vision of an education system where every child and young person feels valued and is actively supported and nurtured to reach their fullest potential. We are more than fortunate, indeed I would say we are blessed beyond measure in Ireland, to have an education system that is world recognised with committed and dedicated staff. However, I think it is fair to say that the Irish education system, despite all its many pluses, is not without its challenges. In my role as Education Minister, the task is to meet the challenges and to support our school leaders, teachers, parents, and the entire school community to deliver a nurturing and inspiring education for each and every child in our care. This morning, as I have said, I hope to outline a number of the challenges we face, but also, equally importantly, how we are taking or perhaps seizing the opportunity to collectively work with school communities to address these challenges. Through this work, we seek to support each and every child to realise their fullest potential and make the most of their own unique gifts, their own unique talents, and their own unique abilities. The poet Amakai reminds us that the windows of a classroom should always open to the future. With this in mind, I am always reminded that one of the most important strengths of education is that it can prepare students for the great unknown that is the future. Curriculum has been described as the stories that one generation chooses to pass on to the next. This may have been true in the past, but now, today, we frame curriculum as the space in which our children and young people, in the care of our teachers and SNAs, shape their own stories for the time to come, having listened to the stories of times gone by. The stories will be similar in many ways, but also different. And that, for me, reflects both the beauty and the power of education. That said, too, we must acknowledge it is important that our curriculum adapts and that it is flexible and resilient to meet the challenges of not just today, but the challenges of tomorrow. We need to continue to evolve so that our education system serves our students' interests and abilities and those of our school communities, and indeed equips them for the future. Plato reminds us that nothing ever is, it is always becoming. An observation which I personally feel is especially relevant to the world of education. We must never stand still in the world of education. And so with that in mind, I launched a new primary curriculum framework in March of this year. A quarter of a century, imagine, since the last primary curriculum was developed. This new approach sets out a blueprint for enhancing primary and special education for the coming years. The revised primary curriculum will emphasize the development of skills like critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, communication, collaboration, all of which are essential for success in an evolving, ever-changing society. We also need, of course, to enable our students to demonstrate their learning. We cannot change the way we educate if we do not also change the way in which we assess that education. In essence, the opportunity we provide students to show what and how they have learned. This was at the forefront of my mind when I announced an ambitious programme of work for a reimagined senior cycle of education, where the student, rightly, is at the centre of the senior cycle experience. Last month, I announced that we now can accelerate the pace of change so that students can benefit earlier from this redevelopment of senior cycle, with the first tranche of revised Leaving Certificate subject curricula happening 2 years earlier than was planned, beginning in September of 2025. All new and revised subjects will incorporate additional assessment components separate to the traditional written exams. They will be assessed externally by the State Examinations Commission, and equality and fairness will continue to be at the heart of this process. In effect, this means that students who begin their Leaving Certificate studies in September of 2025, in many of their subjects, they will no longer have to face 100% of their exams on one day in June. I have never, ever felt that it was right that a student would be expected to achieve everything in one moment in the month of June. I've never felt it was fair. And so now, as we move forward, in advance of taking the Leaving Certificate in their final year, they will have at least 40% of the exam completed before they take the final papers in June of Leaving Certificate year. It is right that we maximise opportunities for students to excel, to showcase their talents and abilities, and this is one step forward in doing that. The second step means also that the type of assessment for students will be different. There will always be a place for the written exam, but there must also be a place for other types of assessment. So, for example, that a student might have a talent in crafting and animation. That should be considered, that should be marked, and it should be worthy of the same standing as the written component. Or to conduct an experiment, or whatever the case might be. We have enormously talented and gifted students. Their giftedness should be reflected in the exam system. We begin that process in September of 2025. On an entirely different note, the rich heritage of our Irish language also provides fertile ground for reflection on today's education theme. I am drawn to the Irish word dawn, which O'Donnell's dictionary defines as a gift or an offering. We are all familiar with the idea of a dawn as a poem. However, O'Donnell offers several additional meanings. A dawn can be a craft or a calling. Dawn may also mean fate, what is in store for us, an rud atá in ann doing. Each of these meanings has a relevance and a particular relevance for education. Education is a dawn or an offering that we make to all of our citizens. It is not simply a matter of the educator giving and the learner receiving. It is a calling out and development of the gifts that are already latent in the learner. Education involves a calling for the teacher as much as for the learner. In decades gone by, it was not unusual to hear of someone getting the call to teach. And in Ireland, there has always been a sense of teaching as a vocation with a strong moral and ethical purpose. As the author Philip Pullman has said, true education flowers at the point when delight falls in love with responsibility. In terms of dawn as a poem, I think of Michael Davitt's poem An Tostas Gara, which means to sift the silence. In it, he talks of the poet being amongst us all, sharing in both the madness and the joy of life. And then the poet retires to a quiet space from time to time to sift the silence. This is exactly what teachers do. They live in our communities. They teach our children and young people every single day. And then when our children and young people have gone home, in the quiet of the classroom or elsewhere, our teachers reflect on the day gone by and look to the day ahead. It is a gift and a noble calling to be a teacher. And I know there are many teachers here present, and I say that from my heart, from my own experience as a teacher. The late, great John B. Keane used to say that to be of Kerry is both a gift and an awesome responsibility. To be a teacher, it is equally so. It is a gift and an awesome responsibility. And we who are blessed to be called to the profession remember that every single day. In terms of other challenges, I am conscious that teacher supply remains a significant issue for many schools. However, it is interesting to note that compared to 2019, we have over 5,000 more teaching posts in our schools. We've invested in inclusion to ensure more teachers for children with special educational needs. We've invested in reducing the ratio of children to teachers. This means that in terms of pupil-teacher ratio, we are at an historic low of 23 students to 1 teacher. But notwithstanding these challenges, this year alone too, we have more than 3,500 newly qualified teachers registering with the Teaching Council, so that the total number of teachers on the Council's register is now almost 120,000 teachers. But I am conscious that more work remains to be done, and the Department of Education will continue to work intensively with all education partners to develop and implement creative solutions to address teacher supply shortages. We want to ensure that bright, committed, talented and inspiring people continue to be drawn to share their gifts and their giftedness as teachers. Looking at the evolution of Irish history since O'Connell's time, it is clear that he was a person ahead of his time. His unwavering commitment to equality for all, when slavery was legal and women did not have the vote, is but one example. And his equal dedication to exclusively peaceful means to achieve one's goals when Europe had just emerged from war and faced 2 more over the next 100 years or so is another. As regards education, in terms of equality, we know that an education system only works when it works for every single child. I, as Minister, want to ensure that our school system is a place where every child and young person feels included, valued, and actively supported, where all their talents and creativity are nurtured to blossom in ways unique to them and appealing to all others. It was the American founding father, John Adams, who said, "I must study politics and war, that my sons may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy, in order to give their children the right to study painting, poetry, and music." We must, of course, forgive Adams for his focus on one gender only. But given we are here today, we should also remember that when Daniel O'Connell set up the Precursor Society in 1838 to begin his campaign for the repeal of the Act of Union between Ireland and Great Britain, he actively encouraged women to join as members. Professor Mary O'Dowd of Queen's University Belfast has written in the History of Ireland magazine that the Precursor Society was the first Irish political association that formally admitted women. And look where that has led. No doubt yet another topic for another session of an O'Connell school. But I think it is important that we remember the many aspects and the many legacies of O'Connell. The writer Virginia Woolf used to say that for most of history, anonymous was a woman. And she was perhaps right. Women may have been anonymous, but they were working. They were doing what needed to be done. And when the call was there, they came. And I admire O'Connell for celebrating that potential and affording that opportunity early in his time when it came to women. In terms of inclusion in education, we must concede that education provides the potential for addressing many, many challenges of social exclusion, removing barriers faced by students, including socioeconomic and educational disadvantage, promoting good citizenship and enriching culture. Significant work and investment is also underway to ensure that every child is fully supported to access the curriculum and to thrive within the school setting. In the last few years, there has been a very significant increase in the number of children and young people identified as having additional education needs, including autism. Demand for new special classes at post-primary level is expected to increase significantly over the next number of years. It is an absolute priority for me and indeed for the Department of Education and for the National Council of Special Education to ensure that every child has a school place that is suitable to their needs. Investment in special education has increased steadily over the last 3 years of the budgets. Budget 24 provides that over 2.7 billion of the current expenditure of the Department of Education will be invested to support special education, representing 26% of the department's total allocation. By the end of this year, we will have more than 3,000 special classes in the system, 130 special schools, and our work continues. Our schools, as well as being places of welcome, must also be places of safety. Since February of 2022, schools have become safe havens for over 17,500 children and young people fleeing from the terrors of war in Ukraine. I could not be more proud as Minister for Education of how our schools have led the way in welcoming, supporting and integrating these children and their families into our school communities and into wider communities. Children are cared for, nurtured and provided with friendship and a sense of belonging in our schools. To support our schools in this work, the department has provided additional English language tuition to help with the day-to-day challenges and a range of guidance and resources. 16 local teams, led by the education and training boards called RAELT teams, build on existing regional education support structures to assist families and young people to secure places in our schools. And we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to these RAELT teams, the length and breadth of the country, run out by the ETBs, who have done magnificent work to ensure that children who are coming from war-torn zones, irrespective of where in the world, that they find a place of welcome in our schools. And of course, as always, that work of welcome is done by the staff and the students on the ground in each individual school. It is so very important that children's education is not interrupted by war, and our response has ensured exceptionally high attendance rates amongst Ukrainians and other young children of school-going age. In fact, we have one of the highest school retention and presentation rates, particularly of Ukrainian students, right across Europe. Ukrainian students entering 5th year in September just gone will also now be able to sit a leaving certificate exam in the Ukrainian language. Enormous credit is due to our schools for the agility and warmth and steadfastness of their response. Of course, we continue to face challenges to meet the capacity needs driven by this humanitarian crisis, both in terms of physical school buildings and in human resources. However, we will continue to strive to address each and every one of these challenges. A development in education which I believe O'Connell would be particularly supportive of if he were to be transported into the modern era is the recognition that children and young people have in the education system, the recognition that they have a right to a meaningful say in decisions that impact them. The Department of Education has recently established a dedicated unit, the Student Participation Unit, to promote the voice of children and young people and to ensure that they have meaningful input into the development of Department of Education policy. Already, inspections, curriculum development and policy development processes all benefit from the input of children and young people. I am pleased also to say that since I have become Minister for the first time, young people now sit around the decision and consultation table with all of the other partners in education. So we have the teacher representatives, the parent representatives, the managerial body representatives, and for the first time, we have the student representatives who sit around that table. Now, I tell the students, we don't always all agree around that table, and it's very important to remember that. But we do always have an opportunity to hear each other's perspective, to appreciate each other's perspective, and eventually, between us, we seek to hammer out a pathway forward. In all my years in education, it has been my best experience that when students get the opportunity, they always rise to the occasion. The trick is to ensure that they get the opportunity. Education must always be to the fore in providing opportunities, leadership and otherwise, opportunities for children and young people to shine. They will never, ever let us down if we give them that opportunity and if we invest in their potential and possibility. As I begin to conclude, I just want to speak briefly on another note about Budget 2024. Because I do believe that this budget and previous budgets over which I have presided in terms of the department represents the very strong support that we in government wish to extend to families, particularly, for example, in terms of the cost of education for young people. As of this school year, all children enrolling in primary school receive all books and all classroom resources free of charge. This is a groundbreaking initiative which has reduced costs for families significantly. It impacts across every single community, every school, every family, and ensures that every child can enter the classroom on a level footing. In this first year of the programme, I am exceptionally pleased to have now also secured sufficient additional funding in Budget 24 to roll out this free school books and classroom resources scheme to junior cycle students from the next school year. We in the Department of Education are ambitious for our education system. Under Budget 2024, €10.5 billion has been allocated to my department, representing remarkably the third largest allocation across all government departments. This highest ever budget and the increased investment in staffing and other measures over the last number of years reflects the importance government places on the education of our children and young people. The world has changed so very much since the times of Daniel O'Connell. We have seen the explosion of the Industrial Revolution, a cultural revival, 2 world wars, and the emergence of many more nation states, as well as the global pandemic and the ever-palpable reality of climate change. And no doubt, there are many more challenges on the horizon. And as we in education look to play our part to face these challenges, we need look no further than Daniel O'Connell himself for inspiration. For O'Connell had his own educational challenges in his youth due to the restrictions imposed by the penal laws on Catholics. He had to get his early education from a hedge school master, and he was barred from studying in any universities in either England or Ireland. He was only able to further his education because a wealthy uncle sent him to the famous school of St. Omer in northern France. Turtle Bunbury, the historian, has recounted how his headmaster there, Dr. Stapleton, gave him a very promising school report. And I quote, "Unless I am very much mistaken, this boy is destined to be a remarkable figure in society." This is what he wrote. Now there was a teacher who could spot potential in a student. O'Connell's story and the story of education in Ireland reminds us of how much we can overcome, how much we can achieve when we work collaboratively, when we work together. Welcoming Ukrainian children, children with additional needs, young people, all young people into our schools. Sustaining essential services, including education during a global pandemic. Responding to and shaping the evolution of cutting-edge technology. As we face into the second century of Irish independence, mindful of the totality of relationships which are so important to our progress near and afar, I am proud as Minister for Education of how we are seeking to sustain the best and nurturing the new to sustain generations to come. I will conclude as I began earlier. As Plato tells us, nothing ever is, it is always becoming. We in education will seek every day of our lives to strive, to do better, to be better, to become better in the best interests of the children and the young people that we serve every single day. Gur míle maith agaibh go léir.
Thank you very much, Minister, for giving us that glimpse into some aspects of your report card. But even beyond that, for I think giving us a wider kind of conceptualization of education in which that report card is placed is not often done. And you also did it, of course, in relation to the teachers by kind of suggesting that wider culture in which teachers exist. And we appreciate, as I said again, your time and the trouble you took to come here. Unfortunately, we can't have time for questions, but I'm going to break for about 5 minutes, if I may. We want to take some photographs up here. I know some members of the O'Connell family are here. I didn't warn them about this, and they tend to be shy people, but I'll ask them to overcome the shyness. We might just take some photographs here, and then the minister has to leave, all within about 5 minutes. So bear with us just to do this, okay? Okay, can I call your attention to, we'll just move on to the next session. It'll be chaired by Dr. Declan Downey, who is from North Kerry, but we forgive him that. But anyway, he's a long-time supporter of the school, has attended, I think, every school since we were founded in 2013. So I'll hand over the podium now to Declan to manage this session, and we'll try and make up for some of the time we lost with all our talking to get the school open. But anyway, we'll see what we can do. Thanks.
Thank you, Maurice, for your very kind words of introduction and also for stamping my visa coming across the River Lawn and the Main for the last 9 years that we've been running this wonderful school. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning we have just had a fascinating presentation from our Minister for Education, and following on that theme of education, etc., We now have Ireland Changes and Challenges, lecture to be given by Professor Patrick Clancy. Now, Patrick Clancy is one of our distinguished sociologists, and particularly on access to education, and he has written a very influential work among his many publications, but the particularly influential work is the 4 national studies of access to higher education and a comparative book called Higher Education in Ireland, a comparative perspective, published in Dublin by the IPA in 2015. And as I said, it's a very influential work, and he has done so much to advance access, equality, diversity, and inclusion. So without further ado, I'm delighted and honored to present my distinguished former colleague at UCD, Professor Pat Clancy. Thank you.
Good morning, and thanks for the invitation to speak at this. I suppose you never need an invitation to visit Kerry, but it's a particular pleasure to participate in an event which commemorates a distinguished statesman, one of our most distinguished statesmen, Daniel O'Connell. I'm a sociologist, and I suppose my main interest is in social change in Ireland, and particularly in education. And just to provide a context for what I'm going to say, there are many candidates, if you like, for looking at the most important features of social change. I mean, the population change is an obvious one. I mean, the population in 1961 was 2.8 million. It's now estimated 5.3 million, which is almost a doubling. The growing multiculturalism, another feature of social change in Ireland, where yesterday the CSO, they upstaged me a bit because they previously estimated that 14% of the population are non-nationals. It was 3% in 1961, right? Now, the estimated figure actually might be 14% in this year, perhaps, right? Another dimension of change would be occupational change. In the early 60s, 24% of the population worked in agriculture. It's now 4%. So now I'm going to talk about change in education, because it's the one that I've done most research on. In terms of the outline, what I'm going to talk about is the expansion. I'm going to talk about as a sociologist, I'm looking at kind of structural problems in the educational system. I'm going to talk a bit about second level and third level, and then I'm going to talk about equality of opportunity. That's more or less the outline of what I'm going to talk about. Expansion is an extraordinary, if you like, the pace of expansion in higher education is little short of extraordinary. In the 1960s, before free education was introduced, a full 15% of the population of the age cohort completed their education at primary level. They never moved on to post-primary. They were called national school terminal leavers. Currently, obviously, post-primary education is universal, and a full 95% of the age cohort now complete Leaving Cert, which is quite phenomenal. 2/3 of the age cohort now go on to higher education. And if you look at, let's say, the education of young adults in the 25 to 34 age group, 62% have a higher education qualification. And even in the age group 55 to 64, 1/3 of the population have a higher education qualification. And comparatively, this is an extraordinary achievement. It's the highest in the EU. Now, I saw some figures the other day suggest Luxembourg might be higher, but is Luxembourg? We wouldn't consider Luxembourg a serious contender, would we? In the OECD, which is if you like, the top 38 Western countries, only Canada, South Korea, and Japan slightly exceeds the Irish figure, if you like. So it's quite phenomenal. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what are the driving forces behind this change? And the main driving force, I suppose, is what sociologists would like to call a change in paradigm, if you like. The educational paradigm has changed. The traditional model of education, the emphasis was on personal development with a focus on religious, moral, cultural dimensions. And of course, in a new Ireland, culture was particularly important, language, for example, and history, etc., right? The modern model of a dominant model of education is one which was, if you like, heralded by the impact of the Investment in Education report in the 1965, where education is identified as a form of kind of human capital development. So it's concerned with personal advancement and economic development of society. So very much a kind of economic driven model, if you like, of education. And corresponding to that, I pity the minister has left because I would be giving them, she might be getting notions, is the changing role of government. I mean, an earlier minister, Richard Mulcahy, in the 1950s, he gave a speech about what his responsibility as minister were, and he described himself as a kind of dungaree man, he says, a plumber who takes the knock out of the pipes, who facilitates things to happen. In other words, the main actors are teachers and the managers, who were the churches, if you like, right? And the minister's job was merely to help them out in a way. That's how he perceived his role. Now, of course, the minister has a much more proactive role, if you like, in leading policy and developing new ideas, etc. Right? So that's the context, if you like, of the driving force behind the change. Now, I'm interested in some of the structural problems that arise with a universal post-primary education. And the first issue is a very simple one, if you like. Should we have one school or many schools? And interestingly, in the 1960s, this was a really dominant ideological debate in many European countries. And people looked about the kind of equity implications of, is it a better idea to have all children go to the same school, or should we send children of different interests and different aptitudes and different aspirations to different schools? And very many European countries came down on what we call the kind of comprehensive model. In other words, all children should go to the same school. Some societies, like the German-speaking countries particularly, kept with the old system of having a grammar type education on one hand and a kind of vocational education on the other. Whereas the Scandinavian countries particularly, and Britain, and indeed in the US, the model of second level education that became dominant in the late 60s was a comprehensive model. Now, the Irish, of course, we found, if you like, an Irish solution to an Irish problem. What happened with us? Well, basically, sorry, I'm moving ahead of myself. We started with only secondary schools, right? And then in the 1930s, we added vocational schools, and vocational schools were to provide what was called continuation education and vocational education, 2 to 3 year programs. So you had secondary schools, vocational schools. And then when we were facing expansion after the introduction of free post-primary education, we introduced, I think, a dozen comprehensive schools. And then that model didn't last too long, so they were replaced by community schools. So we've had a kind of a continuum from secondary to vocational to comprehensive to community. And there's a famous episode in the Dáil where the then Minister of Education, Paddy Hillery, was being questioned by Dr. Noel Brown about what's the idea behind comprehensivization, and Dr. Hillery said, well, he said, there's nothing ideological about this. This is a kind of a practical solution to a practical problem. In other words, it's justified not on the basis of ideology in terms of equality, it's justified on the basis of this is the most economical way of, rather than building 2 schools in an area, you build 1 school. So, but the whole ideological debate, if you like, passed us by. We didn't confront it. And you might say, does it matter? Well, it does, in my view, right? And I think the research is fairly emphatic on this, that the most important features of a school are not, I'm sorry to say, as an ex-teacher myself, not the quality of the teachers, it's the characteristics of the students that you enroll. So, for example, what is important is the social class mix of the pupils, the academic climate of the school. So all of those features are determined by the intake into the school. And what we have by accident or design, we have, if you like, inherited a highly differentiated system. So we have at one end, you have fee-paying secondary, then you have other secondary, then you have comprehensive, community, and vocational. And this continuum, if you like, is based on the notion of what's the social class composition of the school. So at the one end, you have upper middle class at the fee-paying secondary, and working class kids, if you like, mainly attend vocational schools. Now, and it does matter because, as I said, the school effects, I mean, a school, we all are familiar with the notion that families are important in determining students' achievement. If you like, the resources of the family, the cultural resources of the family, the economic resources of the family. But we are less prone to accept the notion that schools have an independent effect, if you like, on children. And in a sense, what we have done is we've offered children not quite the same opportunity. We offer them a differentiated opportunity. So if you go to a fee-paying secondary school, almost all the kids will have very high aspirations. They all expect to go to college. They all expect to go to Trinity or UCD or UCC or UL or whatever, right? If you go to a vocational school, oh, not that many maybe, right? Or if they're talking about third level, they're not necessarily aiming at the top, the high points, if you like, right? So schools have an independent effect, irrespective, if you like, of the particular personal characteristics of the people who attend it. And this is most obvious in urban areas. Now, one of the great virtues of standalone rural schools, and I'm talking about secondary schools, and they could be community, or they could be vocational, or it could be secondary. In other words, a school that attracts the entire clientele of the locality, if you like, right? And surprise, surprise, they very often have better results, if you like, right? In the round, you know, if you look at the achievement of the entire cohort, if you like, right? They do better. So when I started documenting access to third level education, one of the first things, I shouldn't have been surprised perhaps, is that a lot of counties in the western counties of Ireland, like rural counties, Mayo, Leitrim, Galway, Donegal, not so much Donegal, Kerry, Clare, had very high rates of admission to higher education, much higher than Dublin, for example. Right? And one of the reasons, I mean, it's something to do with the family background, but it also has to do with the school background, if you like, right? That the schools have that positive effect on everybody's aspiration. Now, when you look at third level, some of the same, if you like, there's interesting parallels, how the third level system evolved. We started in the 1960s, and I'm not going back beyond that, right? We had basically a dominant university system. There was universities and a tiny technological sector in Dublin, Cork, Limerick area, right? And teacher training college as well, but universities were dominant. And in 1960, they established a Commission on Higher Education. This was meant to recommend developments for the future. Surprisingly, it had very little impact on policy today. Mind you, it took 7 years to report, so you begin to wonder, right? A commission was set up in 1960, reported in 67. And their main recommendations were for expansion were what they called new colleges. And new colleges were a kind of what I call university light. In other words, they were universities of a sort who would only offer undergraduate program, no postgraduate work, for example. Now, nobody took heed of their recommendation because concurrently, after the investment in education report and another report from the OECD on the training of technicians, the government had already decided to develop what became known as RTCs, regional technical colleges. And the regional technical colleges were to provide for education of technicians mainly. And in its original conception, it was to span upper second level and third level. So in other words, they would offer senior cycle second level vocational programs and some third level programs. There was 8 of them were initially recommended. And then Letterkenny, there was a controversy about whether Letterkenny should or shouldn't have one, and it got one. And then Tralee, of course, much more important to the locality, Tralee got one. A decision was taken about a year later to open one in Tralee. So you had 10 initially, then you had 3 more in Dublin. And so essentially after that, we had what became effectively a fully blown binary system. In other words, we have universities and we have technological, well, regional technical colleges. Then the next step was UL, or Limerick, was looking for a university for decades. And there was a commission set up to inquire, and it said, no, the last thing we need is another university in the late 1960s. So we're not going to get a university. Okay, instead we're going to get a National Institute for Higher Education, was set up, and similarly one a couple of years later in Dublin. They were both, no sooner were they set up that they wanted to become universities. So they were set up, and eventually they did become universities, obviously, right? And so what you quickly, you had the NRHEs became universities, the RTCs, when Waterford looked for a university, no, you're not going to get one, but we'll give you an upgrade. So the RTC becomes an Institute of Technology. And no sooner was that decision taken, was all RTCs became Institutes of Technology. And of course, more recently, the Institutes of Technology have now been upgraded to technological universities. So we have what's kind of a classic kind of academic drift, if you like, right? So the policy dilemma is, how do you reconcile conflicting demands? On the one hand, you have the differential aspirations and aptitudes of students, the demands of the labour market who require different skill levels. On the other hand, higher education institutions, their big thing is to maximize prestige. So they want to drop lower level courses. So the RTCs never offered second level courses. They only offered third level courses. Initially, certificate and diploma, then degrees, then master's degrees, right? The next thing they wanted to offer was doctoral degrees. So you have this process of academic drift. Equally, institutions want to focus on research reputation, more important than teaching, okay? And so what happens then is you begin to look elsewhere. Who's going to provide the technology, the lower level technological skills? So we're now looking at colleges of further education. They're going to offer, and the latest thing is that colleges of further education are going to offer the beginnings of third level programs, which I think, personally, I think is a mistake. In other words, they shouldn't be just seen as alternatives to third level education. They should be valued in their own right, but in any event, okay. The other final problem I want to talk about, and the one that I've, I suppose, done most work on, is equality of opportunity as an objective. And so if economic objectives were the main driving force behind educational policy, the second one was always an equality objective. And the reason this is important, because traditional societies, if you like, relied on inheritance. In other words, where you came from and where you ended up, depending very much on, did you inherit the farm or the business, right? Whereas in the modern society, the emphasis on, well, you have to achieve your position through education. So instead of relying on inheritance, you're now relying on educational achievement. And there was a great optimism in the 60s particularly, that this would lead to a much greater sense of equality, because now it's not a question of an accident of birth. We're now talking about ability and effort, and how can you achieve, right? But it didn't actually herald a great equality, because of course what went wrong? Well, middle class families quickly realized we need to monopolize education to secure the future of our children, in a sense. So now, instead of inheritance being important, now it's your educational credentials. And so education, as well as being a kind of public good that a society benefits from a highly educated population. Education, of course, is a private good. It's also a positional good. In other words, the value of it is a function of its scarcity. So if you're the only person with a first-class honours degree in mathematics, if you like, that's much more valuable than somebody with lower level of qualifications, right? So in other words, that it's this notion of a positional good the scarcity value. So that what you have is a huge competition to gain personal advancement. And the difficulty here, of course, is that this doesn't change the structure of society. So how do you respond to equity? Well, first of all, first response is expand the system, and definitely we have done that. There isn't much more scope for expansion, right? But when you expand the system, it's only those who have the resources, if you like, are going to do better in it. So what you need to do is, how do you enhance the prospects of people from less advantaged backgrounds benefiting from education? And to be fair, we've done fairly well in Ireland. The Minister was talking about some of them. We have differential support for preschools, we have the DESH schools, we have the SUSI grants, we have quotas of places reserved for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. We have a specialist agency within the HEH to promote equity. But not everybody is in favour of affirmative action. There's some very interesting cases in the United States recently where Harvard and University of North Carolina, the Supreme Court ruled that they were not entitled to give preferential treatment to minority ethnic groups. So, sorry, in other words, affirmative action is against the law, they're saying, right, against the Constitution. Now, I realise I have to end, but quickly that personally I've spent 2 decades monitoring inequality. I'm not going to bore you with any of those findings, but and more recently, the most recent evidence actually is really fascinating evidence is from the Growing Up in Ireland study, where they have now interviewed people. They started interviewing them when they were age 9 and now they were age 20. So most of them had either gone to college or gone into employment. And there were really fascinating findings about, you know, how education, first of all, the transformation that has taken place, right? With 2/3 of the population going on to higher education. And also the progress that all social groups, but the people, of course, who benefited, what we've discovered is that you will only reduce inequality if you first saturate the demand for the middle classes. In other words, when the middle class can take no more places in higher education, if you keep expanding, obviously working class will take the places, right? And when that happened in the late 60s in access to post-primary education. It now has happened in access to third level education. And what happens then, of course, is the middle class say, well, okay, we're going on to third level education. I better make sure I get into the right college and get into the right program. So in other words, that it's a continuous battle, if you like, to gain personal advantage. And this educational struggle is only part of a kind of economic policy in a sense, because some people argue, and I would accept the view, maybe the best way to increase equality in education is to eliminate poverty, for example, in our society. So in other words, economic policy becomes, and my final point is that the Berkeley historian Sheldon Rotblat, who's a historian on higher education, he talks about this, if you like, impulse of this whole controversy about equality. He says it's linked to a kind of differential moral impulses, or you might say competing visions of democracy. On the one hand, you have the kind of liberal democracy, which has emphasis on freedom, pursuit of self-interest, meritocracy, competition, competitive individualism. On the other hand, you have the kind of social democracy, which is the starting point is the common good. It involves controlling market forces and competition, which of course competition always favours those with most resources. It involves some affirmative action in favour of the less privileged. And in a sense, that's the debate that underlines policy choices in education, if you like, right? Okay, I leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Pat, and I'm sure we're going to have some very interesting questions for your presentation at the end of this session. Now, reflecting upon the changes that have been taking place in education, as Pat has very interestingly outlined, we now have to complement that changes in the wider society and particularly in political attitudes, etc. And in this regard, it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Gary Murphy of Dublin City University, where he is the Professor of Politics at the School of Law and Government. And he has written on this topic of electoral competition in Ireland since 1987, and more recently, a riveting book, if I may say so, Haughey. So without further ado, pleasure to introduce Professor Gary Murphy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Declan. I won't bore you all with tales of living with the ghost of Charles Haughey. My notes tell me I should make a joke about Cork football, but it's really too painful, so I won't. But it's a great privilege to be here this morning at the invitation of Maurice Brick, who I've admired for many years, and I must thank him, and also to be in the company of Patrick Clancy, whose work I have admired and learned from over the decades. If I say so modestly, I am, I think, a sort of success of the Irish education system. Neither of my parents would have went to secondary school. They were national school leavers. We were born in inner city Cork. The secondary school I went to sent some of us to university. I went to UCC. I was actually a contemporary of the minister, Norma Foley, although I can't believe she doesn't remember me. And so, yeah, and so my journey certainly to the privileged position I hold now, I owe to the education system and to some radical decisions taken by politicians. And in that context, I want to talk about the political landscape we face today. I've spent, too long really thinking about modern Irish politics, and we live in an age of, as we know, great volatility. The political landscape has changed dramatically over the course of the last 15 years since the economic crash, and even since the general election of 2020, our politics has been transformed by the twin curses of COVID-19 and Russia's barbarous invasion of Ukraine, both of which have put enormous strain on the body politic to govern and to administer the state. Another huge issue which needs to be addressed by all who govern, of course, is as Professor Clancy alluded to, population change. The recent census, as he said, now we have 5.3 million, up from 3 million just in 1961. And between 1986 and 1991, at the end of a relatively brutal period of emigration, the state suffered a small decline of about 15,000 people. But since then, we've had this massive increase in our population, 2 million over the course of 2 decades. 1961, which Professor Clancy mentioned, a very important date in modern Irish history because it's when we first applied to join the EEC. It would take us a decade and longer to gain entry to that relatively exclusive club. But what's striking about that debate over the course of those 10 years is that pretty much everybody in the state was in favour of doing so, except a few sort of what we might now call far left anti-colonialists. But it would take a long time for us to, as us use the royal we, the Irish state, to realise that we had far more to offer the globe and to offer the EU than simply our people by dint of immigration. Which brings us to another enormous problem the state faces, which is immigration, of course. The recent census results show more than 1 million people, some 20% of the population, were born outside the state. That the state is home to over 5 million people, I think, for the first time since the mid-1850s, is a sign of a strong and growing self-confidence. The 60s are important because it brings us out of the grim decade of the 1950s, where an enormous 60,000 people a year left our shores to emigrate. And the Department of Finance, for one, was happy to see them go because it didn't have then to pay for them. It was also worried about, again, far left Bolshevik types trying to spew revolution, and then worried what would happen when they came home after the end of the Second World War. But of course, many of them didn't come home. And we had a insular, I think, conservative society, which was monolithic, it was white, it was Catholic, and all that to some extent has changed, I think, rather dramatically over the course of the intervening decades. And even if we take just a period since 2020, the census numbers are extraordinary. But not only that, we now reckon that there are 80,000 more Ukrainians in the state than there was even in April of last year when the census was taken. This puts enormous problems on and issues and difficulties on the state's ability to function. Housing remains the greatest challenge facing the state. And I'm sure the Minister, as she's driving to Dublin, will forgive me, but the government really has, I think, failed to get a proper grasp of the problem. It knows what the problem is. It's had all sorts of plans. We've had all sorts of policies going back to well over a decade ago to meet demand. We're now building about 33,000 houses per year, but the state needs 50,000 if it is to meet the demands of the population. And it's not helped then by the varying levels of government in the state. Local government, I think, has been drastically underfunded and underutilized, but we have an enormous problem when some place like Greystones, just to give one example, Wicklow County Council refused planning permission for 98 homes on residentially zoned land this time last year because the town had reached the target for 2028. You might say that's fair enough, but if that's the case, we have no hope whatsoever to solve the housing crisis. And then there's another issue, and I was very struck by Professor Clancy's talk about working class and middle class. And of course, in terms of education, those who are working class become middle class, of course, because of the huge increase in numbers going to education. But the problem now for the middle classes, and I include myself in this, is that our children are never going to, well, they're hopefully leave at some stage, but they're not leaving in their 20s. They're living with their parents until they're into their early 30s, which causes another huge problem. There's a great irony in the current Taoiseach, who I admire very much, Mr. Varadkar, talking of Fine Gael being the home ownership party, when home ownership has declined from 70% in 2011 to 68% in 2016 to 66% currently. And the table is only going one way. I mean, I listened carefully to the Minister talking about the budget and the huge sums, and the government has spent enormous sums we couldn't have even imagined a decade ago. I mean, she talked of 2.6 billion, which is an enormous amount of money. The problem is, and if you take something like housing, I mean, where is the big idea in housing? Where is the Donogh O'Malley idea, free secondary education? I mean, the far left say give everybody a house. We know that can't work. But there's been a lot of tinkering, I think, and not enough thinking about how the state can actually manage to accommodate and put rules over the heads of its citizens and of those who want to live here. And I do pay credit to the government for spending some, vast amounts of money, but I'm not convinced it's really getting us anywhere. Another problem, of course, then is the existential threat the state and the planet faces from climate change. I mean, I think young voters coming to the polls for the first time, the election we expect to happen in 2025, will be driven by climate change issues. It was very interesting that the government was told earlier this year by the Environment Protection Agency that 51% legally binding target for the reduction of emissions by 2030 will be missed. The EPA gloomily predicted that a 29% reduction was only possible if all the plans that are currently proposed are successfully implemented. And really the chances of that, I think, must be pretty much zero when every crucial carbon emitting sector, including agriculture, industry and transport, is well on course to significantly exceed their imposed targets. The EPA wants to firm up existing carbon reduction plans seeking a far more ambitious 2024 climate plan to close the widening gap between the imaginary ideal of reaching targets and reality of what has been achieved to date. Yet I think the question must be asked, how is the government to meet these legally binding ambitious targets in the face of a growing and aging population? A similar tale could be told in health. Any of you who read the Sunday Times, I had a column in last week's paper talking about the difficulties of being the Minister for Health. I mean, as I said, Declan kindly mentioned my work on Mr. Haughey. Way back in the late 1970s, when he was Minister for Health, his great plan to become Taoiseach was that he would spend, vast amounts of money in health. A decade later, when he was Taoiseach, he had an enormous row with Rory O'Hanlon, who said, the government, you have to stop cutting health spending. And why were they cutting health spending? Because there was a tremendous risk to the stability and viability of the state in the light of the recession of the 1980s, when the IMF, who sadly came to our doors in 2011, were knocking in the late 1980s. The correspondence between O'Hanlon and Haughey is quite interesting, to put it. And to put it mildly, he said, and it's something I think that might resonate with people today, that notwithstanding the vast amounts of money being spent, he wasn't convinced the service was getting any better. And for those who have to go to University Limerick Hospital and stay on trolleys for 2 to 3 to 4 days, I mean, who was to say he is wrong? I mean, I'm a great admirer of the public health service. My late mother spent a long time in Blanchardstown Hospital recently. And once you're in the service, it's fantastic. It's getting in is half the problem. And yet we spend absolute billions on health. Health spending accounts for over a quarter of gross government spending, but it's also exceeded its targets in 7 of the last 8 budgetary cycles. My point being, this is not a way, I think, to run a government. And look at the National Children's Hospital. So for those of us with children and we need to merge to get to James's, well, we'll still be waiting. Stephen Donnelly, when he was in opposition, told the then Minister for Health, Simon Harris, that he would be fired if he worked in the private sector because of the failure to get the hospital built and to spawn in this or rein in its spending. Well, the same could simply be said of him. It's now going to be another year and a half before that hospital is open. And now perhaps no politician can make a success of the Ministry of Health. The sums are too vast. The logistics are extraordinarily complex. The outcomes for patients are slow. Internal machinations between the department and the HXC often explosive, to put it mildly. I mean, my conclusion, I think, is that government is supposed to be about a battle of ideas and ideas. 5 minutes, I promise. And the verdict, I think, is still out on who's responsible for the economic crash of 15 years ago, which is still resonating quite dramatically all across our state. I mean, I'm now working on a biography of Brian Cohen, who admitted that with the benefit of hindsight, certainly certain policy errors had been made during the boom years, and that these had developed or deepened, I should say, the crisis. But he did insist that he and his government made all policy decisions based on the best advice available to them at the time, from civil servants and external consultants. Now, with all due respect to him and to the most of the political class, who I said I have much admiration for, such an approach basically absolves the political class of any responsibility for policy makers. It's your fault, Minister. It's your fault, Mr. Civil or Miss Civil Servant. It's not my fault. I just did what you told me. And again, I don't think this is a way to run a government. Our governments have become, I think, sadly technocratic and sadly lacking in ideas. I'll finish with just reference to the ongoing issue about the huge amounts of of refugees and asylum seekers who have come into our state wishing to make it their home. And we saw the row this week between the Minister for Integration, Roderick O'Gorman, and some of his colleagues in relation to how to deal with that. I mean, there has been for a country which knew very little but economic failure and insularity, the Irish state's an enormous success story when it comes to the influx of people who want to live here. And I'm not convinced it's simply because that's mentioned in newspapers this week that our social protection rates are much better here than they are in the rest of Europe. One might say that actually we are the beacon of light for other states in treating those less fortunate than ourselves. But it has left the states frantically searching for solutions to meet what I think are its moral and its legal obligations to those seeking asylum here. And I have no time or truck for those who I might describe as being on the far right, anti-politics agitators who suggest, while receiving negligible amount of votes, that there are easy solutions to the problems of asylum seekers in a sort of Ireland first, Ireland is full type of way. It seems to me that these people are against everything but for nothing. They oppose asylum seekers, refugees, transgender rights, sex education in schools, vaccines, particularly COVID-19, horror of horror globalization, and big pharma. Notwithstanding the enormous amounts of employment foreign direct investment has given to the state. These people look to the past for their inspiration, they fear the unknown, fear the foreigner, want to blame all ills of society. But I think we know that it is not, that's not the case here in Ireland, which was, I said, insular, Catholic, conservative, and economically had failed until we decided to look outwards. So to finish, notwithstanding the difficulties of housing immigrants, the state and its political parties all across the political spectrum are facing up to the task of trying to honour the moral obligation we have to those fleeing war and persecution. And at the same time, our polity is striving to provide economic opportunities and strong social protection net for all our citizens and those who want to be citizens. They need to be resisted, I think, those who agitate for simple populist solutions. They are, as that great chronicler of British life, Shakespeare, said, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. The short-termism that has plagued Irish policy making since the foundation of the state will need, I think, to be replaced by a long-term vision of how to run a country that more people than ever want to live in. But as we end the decade of centenaries, we live in an Ireland that is robust, democratic, and for all its faults, I think that is something we should celebrate. And I have no doubt that the man for whom we gather here today at this great summer school would agree. Thank you very much.
Now we're just allowing 5 minutes for questions, etc., from the audience. Have we any questions for our speakers? Yes. There's a microphone coming here to you. Yeah.
Just a question about: Are we offering the right combination of skills in the modern third level system for skills for the future? Or are there changes we need to make?
I think the answer is probably not, well, to some extent, we may be training the people, but some of the people we want are leaving. I mean, I wasn't impressed recently when the response to, let's say, the scarcity of doctors and nurses, the minister says, we'll let's educate more. I mean, it's a bit like somebody, if the bucket is leaking, you don't add more water. What you do, you try and fix the leak. And I think to some extent, in some areas, that's an issue, I think, right? There's some, but I mean, it is extraordinary. There's never a direct relationship between the courses you offer in third level and what the employment opportunities. I mean, it's extraordinary. Let's say arts graduates or social science graduates, and my God, they end up everywhere, you know. So in other words, there isn't, that the universities will say, I mean, Simon Marginson was probably the key figure in Western higher education. He wrote something recently of the problem about has employability replaced higher education, and his argument is it almost has, and he said this is really regrettable. In other words, that higher education is about what the American sociologists call developing cognitive rationality. In other words, higher level cognitive skills, analytical skills, right? As opposed to job. In other words, university isn't a great place for training operatives of any sort, whether it's in medicine or engineering, if you like, right? You have to train on the job to some extent, right? But it is the place where you develop analytical skills. So I think there'll always be a bit of a mismatch, you know, but so that's not a great
The
answer.
flip side of that question is, should everybody be going to university then, or do we need to have more, even more technical colleges to train people in installing heat pumps or, you know, putting up power lines and skills that are in very short supply? But I'm not sure that we have enough courses currently training people for the skills that is needed by the modern workplace of the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah, you're probably right, but I mean, that's why I commented, I feel like, a little bit disparagingly about, in other words, where institutions want to drop 2-year programs in favor of 4-year programs, and drop 4-year programs in favor of 6-year programs, if you like, right? And so therefore, suddenly the further education has, in a sense, is coming into its own. It looks as if that's where the training of a lot of the skills are going to be, which we expected, let's say, the RTCs to do. Now we're going to look to further education, right? So there's a bit of what we might call goal displacement, if you like, going on, I think, yeah.
Could I just make one point about that? I agree completely, and I think the nature has changed in terms of what what I know institutes of technology were meant. But I have very little truck with those people who say, "Oh, we have far too many arts degrees in the state now, and you know we should be sending these kids to become plumbers or truck drivers or painters or whatever." I mean, we still offer that, but you know you'll find that most of those who argue for the lack of art, or that we should get rid of arts degrees, have degrees themselves. And why should we have a scenario where, oh, I had the great joy, as I did myself, and privilege of going to university to study history, but I'm not sure you should do it, because I really think you should be a plumber, because we don't have enough plumbers. So I would have very little truck with that argument.
Yes. We just take one more question. So yes.
Thanks, Declan. And maybe just one question to Gary. One issue you didn't mention was the fallout from Brexit in relation to the putting unification of this island back on the agenda again. And with the rise of Sinn Féin now and their possibility that they certainly would probably be the largest party after the next election, if not in government, is the government right to not have a long-term view on this issue and to keep it?
If thanks, Ruth. If Mirish gives me another 20 minutes, I'll happily give a talk on Brexit. But no, it's a very valid and fair point. I'm very struck by when Leo Varadkar and Micheál Martin speak about Irish unification and about Brexit, that they're very conscious of making the point that they are Republicans in the real sense of the word and do want a united Ireland. And of course, in one way, the debate is about how do we get to that united Ireland. I'm a great supporter when Micheál Martin put in place the Shared Ireland initiative, and I do think we have to reach out and to understand the unionist position, which I think many Republicans, including Mr. Haughey, of course, never made any attempt to understand. I mean, some of us look at unionism now and say it's so recalcitrant. You know, why can't it accept the Windsor framework? I agree with that myself, but I think we have failed to look at the unionist perspective. But you know, I would love to see United Ireland. Whether it'll happen in my lifetime, I still have doubts. But Brexit certainly has changed the whole dynamic. I think for both politics here in the Republic, certainly for politics in Northern, but also for politics in in Britain itself, where, you know, I was very struck when Norma Foley talked about the teachers of Daniel O'Connell. Well, we know that the teachers of Boris Johnson, so this man should be left nowhere near public life, because he will wreck it, and I'm afraid that has come true.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree we've had some fascinating insights from our two speakers, Pat and Gary, this morning. And I know that there are many others thinking of asking you questions, but time is of the essence. And I think the aroma of the freshly brewed coffee and the scones wafting over here will, I suppose, excite even more interesting conversation over refreshments now, and I'm sure you'll be happy to talk to everyone over refreshments. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And I think we're just keeping well within time, so thank you very much. A 10-minute break.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This session is going to be chaired by Dr. Darrell Rooney, who has been a long-time visitor to our school. He came here as a student, and I'm glad to note that he got his PhD there a few weeks ago. So we're asking him to chair this session. But before I do, I just want to correct something I said earlier on. I should have recognized Councillor Norma Moriarty, who is the chairperson of, I get this right now, Kenmare Municipal District, of which Cahirsiveen is part. And she wears a chain of office, although she hasn't with her. She doesn't have it with her today, I think. But at the same time, I'd like to welcome her, because I know people like that are busy people. So thank you, Norma, for coming. Thank you. So with that, can I hand over to Darrell? Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. You're all very welcome back to the next session of the Daniel O'Connell Summer School. Now, as Mara said, it's not my first day at the rodeo here. Unfortunately, though, as you can tell from my name and my accent, I'm a blow-in to these parts. But, as Mara says, the people of Cahirsiveen are incredibly welcoming. Although this morning, when I arrived in after a long drive from 4 a.m. in Dublin this morning, I met the ban on tea in my B&B, and she asked me where I was from, and I said Dublin. And she said, you're a Jackeen. But nonetheless, I have strong credentials. I've been here a number of years, so thank you all for having me once again. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the speakers of this session, which will be exploring the theme Writing and Writers. Our first speaker, Dr. Fiona Brennan, is a theatre historian and independent researcher. Fiona, she is the co-editor of The Art and Ideology of Terence MacSweeney, which was published this time last year by Cork University Press. In 2023, Fiona was awarded a bursary by the Royal Irish Academy for her work on the amateur dramatic movement in County Kerry between 1923 and 1936. This morning, Fiona will speak about Kerry women's writing, retrieving a literary legacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. It's just a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the committee for the invitation. It means a great deal. The performative and dramatic history of County Kerry is a jewel in the rich strata of the kingdom's literary heritage. It is centuries old, beginning perhaps with the articulations of the Milesian leader Amergin, who stepped from his boat to command a mystical invocation of Kerry's natural world. The Irish language, our own language, and then that ancient old tradition, the rich inheritance of the oral Irish language tradition, and the Hiberno English dialect that would sustain a uniquely rich Irish performative playwriting tradition during the 20th century. Our greatest playwrights, and I mention Sigerson Clifford here, who in 1947 premiered, the Abbey Theatre premiered his play The Great Pacificator on Daniel O'Connell. Our greatest playwrights sought to travel to the furthermost areas of rural Ireland, seeking both language and sustenance for the soul amid the natural surroundings. Like John Millington Synge coming to Mountain Stage off the main ring of Kerry route near Limbe, to the home of Philly Harris. Locals used to recall Synge's hours atop Drung Hill, looking out onto the Western world, descending only in time for his tea in the evening. On Drung Hill, he contemplated Philly Harris's stories and the nature of his storytelling. When Synge would leave Mountain Stage for the final time in 1905, he would have the company of the spirit of Christy Mahan and a very clear idea of his character Pegging Mike O'Flaherty, the spirits that helped conjure the masterpiece, the playboy of the Western world, that Western world where the spirit of Amergin roamed. Apart from Kerry as inspiration for writers, the kingdom's own writers boast riches too. Some playwrights more successful than others, and those whose names and achievements have been forgotten. Among these playwrights are 3 Kerry dramatists who I will try to introduce today. The first of these playwrights, Maureen Cregan, is a Clorglan native. Born in 1891, Cregan was brought up in a household that was a hive of cultural activity. A gifted musician, she moved to Dublin in 1914 to study at the Leinster School of Music. There she became involved in the volunteer movement, and it's there she met her future husband, Dr. James Ryan, and they married in 1919. The couple were fervently nationalist and active throughout the revolutionary period. On Holy Thursday, 1916, Maureen had travelled by train to Tralee to deliver a letter to Austin Stack that was concealed in her violin case. James was elected a Sinn Féin TD for County Wexford in 1918. He spent time interned by the British during 1920 and 1921. Vehemently opposed to the 1921 treaty, James was among the thousands of Republicans interned by the Free State government until November 1923. James joined the mass hunger strike in October that year, which was in a protest at the continuing internment. He remained on hunger strike for 35 days. It was during the late 1920s that his wife, Maureen Cregan, set pen to paper to complete her Civil War drama, Hunger Strike. Set in the County Kerry home of Nano and Ned Grady, it is autumn 1923. Ned is on hunger strike in a Dublin prison. The play focuses on the psychological and emotional strains endured by Nano, who is a steadfast supporter of her husband's strike, despite the terrible pressure foisted upon her by her relatives, all of whom are Free State supporters. They demand that Nano instruct Ned to come off strike. The play's structure relies upon letters received by Nano from Ned, and these are closely related and closely based on the actual letters that Maureen received from James in 1923. The play was, unsurprisingly, rejected by the Abbey Theatre in 1931. Although its publication 2 years later received very favourable reviews. In 1936, a production was broadcast on 2RN, later Radio Éireann. Yet the play failed to make any mark on the public's imagination and was never staged during Cregan's lifetime. That same year, in 1936, her first children's novel, Old John, was acclaimed by critics, thus eventually overshadowing her playwriting career. Hunger Strike deals with controversies, including the condemnation by church authorities of hunger strike as an act of suicide. During the play's final moments, a telegram brings good news of Ned's fate. But while family remain in the kitchen, Nano hesitates in reading it in full and reveals only that all men are off strike. She claims to Davy Lucy, her neighbour and confidant, "We're beaten again." When she is alone, only then does she read the telegram aloud. "Suspend your judgment for the present." Cregan's stage directions read that Nano puts her hand against the table, a gesture reflective of relief or one that epitomizes feelings of defeat? That statement's open-endedness may have been a masterstroke on Cregan's behalf, as she claimed to have written the play for international audiences. In March 2022, Hunger Strike premiered at the CYMS Killorglin, with subsequent performances this year, as part of the Killorglin Archives Society's Decade of Centenaries programme. At each and every performance, it was clear that the play had impacted powerfully on audiences, proving Cregan's success in capturing imaginations even 90 years after its publication. And the photograph there is from a performance recently in Sheep's Tira with Susan McCarthy in the lead role as Nana. 2 decades after the publication of Hunger Strike, Cahirsiveen woman, and somebody many people in the audience will know, Cahirsiveen woman and playwright Pauline Maguire Ní Coffey bravely sought to negotiate political and social themes in her drama regarding Ireland's transition, modernisation and change throughout the 1950s. Her time working at the Department of Industry and Commerce in Dublin in the 1940s proved influential on her playwriting career. She and her husband, Cahirsiveen man Paddy Maguire, married in Dublin and eventually returned to Cahirsiveen with their 2 young sons to run the Anchor Bar. Between 1954 and 1963, Pauline Maguire made 13 individual submissions to the Abbey Theatre, comprising of revised versions of some 6 plays, the majority of which still survive in her collection, which remains with the Maguire family. And I have to say that her son Hugh and his wife Chris have been wonderful, and they entrusted me with the collection for long periods of time. Maguire's only Abbey production came in October 1955 with the premiere of her 3-act comedy, The Last Move. It tells the story of a farmer desperate to retire and the demands he imposes on his eldest son if he is to inherit the farm. Its conclusion seems to favour the typical Abbey-style drama, the happy ending with love and marriage secured. However, the play structure underscores the social uncertainties regarding rural Ireland's economic development and land inheritance. On opening night, newspaper reports focused on how this slim, dainty-looking woman, pictured here in the photo, while caring for, and I quote, a husband, 2 children, 1 public house, and 6 greyhounds, managed to write a play. Public curiosity was rife on opening night as crowds gathered on the street seeking a glimpse of this housewife come playwright, causing traffic jams in the process, and I kid you not. The actress and Cahirsiveen native, Brídní Lynchick, and she is 3rd there in the photograph, 3rd from the left. She was daughter of the revolutionary leader and former government minister, Fionn Lynch, appeared in the production. Indeed, Breed's story is a fascinating one for another day. Maguire's drama portrays an Ireland in transition and the detrimental impact created by those still living in the past. In what I believe to be her most powerful play, The Green Dust, in which she brokers contentious themes regarding the division of landed estates and the role of the Land Commission. The Commission's duties having advanced considerably since the foundation of the Irish state in 1922. Although the Abbey had accepted the play in 1957, evidence illustrates Maguire's fraught relationship with its director, Ernest Blythe, and she would not have been the first one. He demanded constant revisions to the script. Enough was enough, and Maguire withdrew her play and instead entrusted it to the wonderful local amateur group, the Ivoronian Players, who premiered The Green Dust in 1959. The Green Dust is set in the gate lodge of the Ornadree estate, once home to the O'Connor family. There, the land agent, Padre O'Leary, lives with his wife Joan and their daughter Grania. Busy overseeing the estate's imminent division, Padder remains oblivious to Joan's scheming and her master plan to scupper the sale. She has filled her daughter's head with romantic notions. Determined to see the estate's restoration, Joan successfully entices its owner, Philip O'Connor, back from the UK. As he succumbs to Gráinne's beauty and charm, he soon accedes to Joan's sly rhetoric. Give it a chance and let yourself find your roots here, for there's nothing in the world to beat the satisfaction of owning land. Philip fails to turn up at the official handover of the estate and arrives at the gate lodge very drunk. Soon, his violent, guilt-ridden self is revealed. Astounded at his wife's betrayal, Padder turns on her. "You bitch! And to think I've been blinded." The incensed locals are heard marching in Ornadree. Suddenly, a glow is cast through the large window across the stage. The great house is on fire. Joan sobs hysterically. "The walls will stand, and they'll be a fine sight. Morning, noon, and night, I'll be looking at them." Maguire directs that Padder moves away towards stairs. Maguire deliberately identifies not just the crumbling of an estate, but the metaphorical crumbling of a marriage. Maguire's work remained popular on the amateur circuit throughout the 1950s and 1960s, and has been revived here in her hometown on a number of occasions. Her great friend, the retired county librarian Kathleen Brown, remembers her friend with great affection still, describing her as one of the most gorgeous people one could ever meet. Although I hold a British passport, I am in fact Irish, and the daughter of an Irish politician at that. So claimed my third and final writer, Bridget Boland. Although not born in Kerry, her associations with the county and her love for Ireland are enough, I believe, to claim her as an adopted daughter. Born in London in 1913, Bridget Boland was the daughter of Ellen Maloney and John Pius Boland, MP for Kerry between 1900 and 1918. The second of 5 children, Bridget and her siblings spent summers in Derrynane, a time which she reflects on in her 1978 memoir, At My Mother's Knee. We lived in Ireland when Parliament was not sitting. My father rented Derrynane from the O'Connells, a rambling 18th and early 19th century house where we lived barefoot and ran wild. On graduating from Oxford in 1937, Boland worked as a continuity announcer at the BBC, and published her first novel, The Wild Geese, a year later. The novel is set in 18th century Ireland and features the story of the Catholic Kinross family's desperate bid to maintain its estate under the penal law system. Boland's prestigious career as a screenwriter began with the completion of her first adaptation of the 1938 play, the thriller Gaslight. Her screenwriting career was a stellar one, and among her successes are the 1956 film War and Peace and Anne of a Thousand Days, starring Richard Burton, for which she received an Academy Award in 1970. Her cousin, Desiree Short, whom I interviewed some years ago, recalled Boland fondly. As a shy teenager, Desiree was dazzled by her glamorous cousin, Bridget, who lived in Paris and Rome, as well as in Hollywood for a time, mixing in prestigious circles. Desiree believes Bridget lived always beyond her means, and she never cooked a meal in her life, Desiree told me, before her retirement to London to live with her sister Maureen. Boland established her career as a playwright during the post-World War II era, indicating Boland's preference was for writing heavy political dramas. As she stated, everything she wrote should leave audiences with an unbearable sense of intensity, and that she succeeded in doing. Her dramatic canon is an impressive one that focuses on political and humanitarian catastrophes in the aftermath of the Second World War. Throughout the 1940s and the 1950s, her drama would premiere in both the UK and on Broadway in the United States. The only Irish premiere of one of her plays, The Return, which is about a woman who is set to leave an enclosed order to return to the modern world after 35 years in seclusion, was staged at the Gate Theatre in 1966. One of Boland's best-known plays, The Prisoner, premiered in the UK in 1954 and starred Alec Guinness. It was adapted and released as a film the following year, in which Guinness reprised his role. A psychological thriller, it caused controversy on its release. Set in an Eastern European totalitarian state, a cardinal, played by Alec Guinness, is falsely accused of treason. His interrogator and old associate of the cardinal's, but now a communist, is confident of breaking the cleric's spirit. The film was banned in Ireland, which did apparently rather amuse Boland, who simply laughed it off. Her plays became popular on the Irish amateur drama circuit, which is really, really interesting. For example, The Prisoner, and you can see a photograph there of the cast, The Prisoner premiered in Athlone in 1984. Boland's 1948 play Cockpit was an ambitious, daring act of imagination, ahead of its time, as it blurred the lines between actor and audience. It is set in the aftermath of World War II, in a dispersal centre or refugee camp for those displaced victims of concentration camps and forced labour camps, all of whom are awaiting transportation back to their homelands. A site-specific play, the dispersal centre is housed in a provincial German theatre. The original production in London featured a mix of European languages and cast the audience in the role of refugees. In the wake of international bloody turmoil, Boland's play is a metaphor, a dramatic strategy employed to ask the questions: how did this happen? Could it possibly happen again? I was thrilled to have been at the revival of the play in Edinburgh at the Lyceum Theatre, which left its audience certainly still with an unbearable sense of intensity. Boland spent the final years of her retirement in Hampshire, where she and her sister Maureen, both avid gardeners, co-wrote the bestseller Old Wives' Lore for Gardeners, Quiet Away from Broadway and Hollywood. It was published in 1977. Bridget Boland died in 1988. In conclusion, I feel it would be remiss of me not to stray towards Derrynane, where incidentally, the Liberator himself delighted in the spirit and fun of lively private theatricals at his home. I am drawn to Derrynane by memory, spirit and creativity of Eileen Dovey-Connell, his aunt, not directly to the masterpiece that is Cuoine Art O'Leary, but to the experiences of Doran Ní Ghríofa, the author of A Ghost at My Throat, a compelling novel that traces Eileen's life and place in history so beautifully. I'm enthralled by the sentiments of Ní Ghríofa when she spoke in an interview of honouring Ní Connell's life, and I quote, "Perhaps I stumbled upon my true work. Perhaps I could honour Eileen Dove's life, gathering every fact we hold to create a kaleidoscope. Ní Ghríofa's intention is to create a spill of distinct moments, fractured but vivid, regarding Eileen's life. In some respects, Ní Ghríofa is describing every historian's dream, every historian's passion, perhaps obsession. I, too, am obsessed by the ancient spirits of Kerry's performative tradition and heritage, proud of these discoveries, eager to share them with you, eager to continue with community's help to retrieve literary legacies like those of Maureen Cregan, Pauline Maguire, and Bridget Boland. Gurmil Mahagul Galea. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Fiona. Our next speaker, I have to say though, before I introduce Paddy, if Bridget Boland is an adopted daughter, then I think Paddy Bush is an adopted son. Although he has the misfortune of being born in Dublin, like myself, he's been living in Waterville a long time. Paddy is an award-winning poet, and he is also a well-known commentator in these parts on the history, literature and culture of South Kerry. Today, Paddy will speak about Derry Nan and the O'Connells. Dr. Paddy Bush.
Gur maithagad Darren agus tá a bhuachas freisin dul de bhuiris agus an cuiste as an currahortam lauert an sa. The full title is on the screen there, Scum Condensed of Irish Bog, the O'Connells and Ivra. The somewhat startling title is in fact the first line of a poem. In November 1835, the Times of London published anonymously an extraordinarily vicious personal attack on O'Connell. Scum condensed of Irish bog, ruffian, coward, demagogue, boundless liar, base detractor, nurse of murders, treason's factor, of pope and priest the crouching slave, while thy lips of freedom rave, of England's fame the viperous hater, yet wanting courage for a traitor, Ireland's peasants feed thy purse, still thou art her bane and curse. Unwittingly, the Times, to my mind, put its sectarian and racist finger on the source of O'Connell's strength and power. Ireland's peasants and O'Connell were bound together by ties of culture, tradition, religion, and language beyond the comprehension of the anonymous versifier. In that sense, the liberator was indeed condensed of Irish bog and was expert at weaponizing that condensation. But rather than depend on the Times' negative caricature, let's look at what the liberator himself said about the mountainous and undeniably boggy landscape of his native Ivra. One of the best known of his statements about his relationship with place comes from his open letter to Walter Savage Landor in 1838, published in the Examiner of London. This is how it ends. Perhaps if I could show you the calm and exquisite beauty of these capacious bays and mountain promontories, softened in the pale moonlight which shines this lovely evening, when all which during the day was grand and terrific has become calm and serene in the silent tranquility of the night. Perhaps you would admit that the man who has been so often called a ferocious demagogue is, in truth, a gentle lover of nature, an enthusiast of all her beauties, fond of each gentle and each dreary scene, and catching from the loveliness as well as the dreariness of the ocean and alpine scenes around, a greater ardor to promote the good of man in his overwhelming admiration of the mighty works of God. And lest it be thought that this was just a clever piece of public grandstanding, here is an extract from a private letter written 5 years before that to William Fagan, who had asked him to attend a supporters meeting in Cork. After nearly 7 months of the most close and unremitting labour, I want the calm and quiet of my loved native hills. These are scenes to revive all the forces of natural strength, to give new energy to the human mind. Permit me then to postpone for some time the day on which I am to meet my friends and the friends of Ireland in Cork. Do not tear me from this love spot until I've enjoyed some of its renovative effects. O'Connell's beloved mountain, sea, and hunting are inseparable from his personality. He did not write poetry, at least in the formal sense, but the language and insights in these passages are those of a person who might well have done so. And in fact, poetry rooted in his place and in the culture of that place was in his blood and breeding. Time does not permit me to explore that poetic duchess in any detail, but three of his forebears must be briefly mentioned. Sean O'Connell, the author of the 17th century Teirv na HÉireann, not to be confused now with Laur Sean Connell of a couple of centuries later, but the 17th century Teirv na HÉireann, also the liberator's grandmother, Máire ní Ghuimh, whose works survive only folklorically, but is a strong presence within that folklore. And the most famous of his forebears, as Fiona has mentioned, his aunt, Eileen Dovney Connell, the putative composer of Queen Arty Léire. Even at a distance of almost 4 centuries, Sean O'Connell's Teirv na HÉireann, written about 1655, carries the force of the contemporary. Vincent Morley, in his recently published O'Chétan go Raftery, has traced 240 dated manuscript copies of the poem made between 1700 and 1900. An extraordinary 168 of these were copied out between 1775 and 1850, dates that almost exactly coincide with the liberator's lifetime. It cannot be definitively said that O'Connell was familiar with Teirv na HÉireann, but he was certainly familiar with the material that formed the basis of its narrative, and I am certain he would have been viscerally as well as intellectually empathetic with much of the perspective embodied in the poem. Teirv na HÉireann recounts the mythological history of pre-Christian Ireland, goes on to deal in learned detail with the Christianization of Ireland. The Anglo-Norman conquest is described as being largely benevolent. But when the poem moves toward the Tudor plantations, and especially into the contemporaneous Cromwellian wars, there is a radical change. Images of slaughter, of keening widows and crying orphans introduce one of the most powerful and technically brilliant passages in the poem. Is doch na dlithe do rinneag dar ngéirghain, sis owen courtis turmi termi deira, wardship livery is court exchequer, kios colostin amane paine, greenwax capias, rich replaven, bonny, phenol, detol, egert, provas, suffre, portre, mera, shiriam, shiniscal, mariscal, cléana, drí beag ella de rinneag de ghaelav, surrender a gheart a dhéanamh. Notice that the extract's opening and closing lines refer to dlí, the law, but the references are to law in a very negative sense. The law is an instrument of oppression rather than an instrument of enablement. There is no need to labor the connection between this passage and the liberator's life work and his ancestors' poetic despair. When we come to Máire ní Ghuimh, the liberator's grandmother, the earthiness of the scum condensed of Irish bog is deeper, at least in her considerable folkloric presence. A quatrain attributed to her was widespread in Ivra in the first half of the 20th century. Believe it or not, it concerns her purported instructions to a tailor who was making a pair of trousers for her husband, Donald Moore O'Connell. This is how Sean Sigerson from Runeen recited it for the collector Taigo Morachu in 1938. Farsing in a gaul, lawn sa chearúin, cumha in a vasta, agus sásta in a hoin. And I've translated it as spacious in the crotch, spare along the thigh, well made in the waistband, and self-satisfied behind. I leave it to yourselves to decide whether Máire Ní Ghríobh's instructions to the tailor were sartorial comments or were sardonic comments about various attributes of her husband, Donald Moore O'Connell. Perhaps the most relevant quotation about Máire Ní Ghríobh is not from herself, but something said about her. November 1936, Taigo Morachu interviewed Sean O'Sullivan from Murriach near Waterville. Here was what was said. Bhíoch an cúnsaléir agus Sean Sigerson a gcuineh chéile a gcúrsaí dlí, agus deirech Sean leis nach le léan a bhí Donal ó bhadó, ach le filíocht a bhí aige ó chaileach de hana bháthir dó. Councillor and Sean Sigerson used to be on opposite side in matters of law. Sean used to say it wasn't through education that Dan used to win, but through poetry that he got from his old crone of a grandmother. Cahirsiveen Léire, composed by Máire Ní Ghríobh's daughter and Daniel O'Connell's aunt, Eileen Dubh Ní Chonaill, deserves a whole series of talks. I want to look at just one passage, a section of her Cahirsiveen where she considers using the power of the law to seek justice for her husband's murder 2 years before her nephew was born. This is my own translation. By Jesus Christ, there's nothing, no headgear, no millinery, nor finely stitched linen, no shoe, no stocking, no furniture or hanging, not even the brown mare's tackling that I won't sell to buy law. And I will travel abroad to petition at court, and if I get no hearing, I will come straight back to the black-blooded savage who rifled my treasure. I think it's interesting that Eileen Dubh places recourse to law, even expensive law, before what seems like more direct and personal revenge. But what's striking is that she sees the law as a distant thing, the seat of power being elsewhere, necessitating that she go abroad, Anán Hartain in the original, on a journey which she anticipates as being in vain. Cahirsiveen Léire, despite its widespread reception as a nationalist poem during much of the 20th century, is infinitely more personal than it is political. But this passage expresses an alienation from the seat and structures of power, as well as a yearning to have access to the institutions of that power, a yearning that will break out in other forms if it is denied. I have no idea whether or not the outlaw's widow ever spoke with her lawyer nephew about such things, or indeed if they spoke at all. What I am certain of is that he would have understood the passage I've just quoted and understood the necessity to put an end to this alienation from the law. And incidentally, he was very proud of his aunt and told Crofton Croker, who was writing a book about the Keane in the south of Ireland, that one of the finest Keanes was written by his aunt. Let me leave the ancestral bog from which the liberator was condensed. Let me leave his own words of love for his home territory. Let me look how others saw him in that landscape. I quote first from a letter written by Maurice Huntingcap O'Connell to the future liberator's mother in 1796, when the young Daniel, Huntingcap's heir and protege, was a 21-year-old student. Now, he wrote the letter in prose, but I divided it into lines because it seems to me to be pure poetry. He is, I am told, employed at visiting the seats of hares at Kilreelig, the earths of foxes at Tarmans, the caves of otters at Bolus, and the celebration of Miss Burke's wedding at Derreen. Useful avocations, laudable pursuits for a nominal student at law. Notice where Huntingcap places the idle student, not in taverns or shebeens, but among hares, foxes, and otters at Kilreelig, Tarmans, and Bolus, and celebrating a wedding at Derreen. All these places in Ivraw are part of the weave of Huntingcap's indignant letter and of the young liberator's growing and formative engagement with the cliffs and sea caves, mountains, townlands, and society of Ivraw. For the rest of this talk, I'll stay at one particular place in Ivraw. That place is Cumachista. And I don't mean the big car park and grotto, which is now called Cumachista on Ring of Kerry Road. That wasn't there until 1830, well, the park are much later, but the road came in 1838. I'm talking about the area around this Bronze Age wedge tomb. The previous slide was a view from that, which is just beside the road, which is now the Kerry Way, but was the road between Derrynane and Waterville and whatever. This wedge tomb is about 900 above sea level. It's liminally positioned on the border between the hinterland of Ballinskelligs Bay and the hinterland of Bordoneen and the Kenmare River. Here, in the late summer of 1828, according to Seamus Fenton, who was born less than 50 years later, the people of those hinterlands gathered to welcome the liberator. After his triumph in the Clare election earlier that year, among them was a school teacher and poet, Tomás Rua O'Sullivan, who welcomed his patron with a song. The song was the anthemic Donal Bean O'Connell Queen. In a moment, I'll play a radio recording kindly made available to me by the great Ivraw singer Tim Dennehy, who has himself recorded Donal Bean O'Connell Queen. The recording was made by Ciarán McMahuna in a house in Moshtaguiha near Waterville. As usual, the word emancipation, the very last word of the song apart from the chorus, is sung as 5 clearly stressed triumphant syllables. And in the background to the singing of the chorus, Fionnán McCullum can be heard dancing steps in time to the tune. McMahuna comments that McCullum, who was born less than 30 years after the liberator's death, told him it was customary to dance a few steps to the chorus of the song.
The song we're going to hear was written by Tomás Rua in honour of Daniel O'Connell and his work for the Irish people after his election to Parliament. Fionnán McCullum introduced me to the singer, Courtney Elisa, who lives just outside Waterville, and he told me that it was customary to dance a few steps in tune with the chorus of the song, and indeed in this recording you can hear Fionnán stepping it out, Courtney Elisa agus Donal Bean O'Connell Queen.
Beg brother, do you
Thank you. This is a link whose sources go a long way back in the folk memory and, the Times might say, into the Irish bog. The same folk memory tells us that Tomás Rua played the fiddle, that he would often dance a few steps when he sang his composition. I visited this wedge tomb many times while I was researching this material. Now, helped by Fionnán McCullum's dance steps and the various versions I have heard of the song since I blew in here 50 years ago, I always now imagine I see and hear Tomás Rua on this capstone, his singing words celebrating his own and his people's hero, his dancing feet beating out a rhythm on this ancient monument that would resonate through the benches of the House of Commons in Westminster. The lines that particularly resonate with me are the final two, nor a vegan dlí fuin féin a reach your hacht emancipation, when the law will be our own again with the dawn of emancipation. Again, an dlí, the aching for law, for indigenous law, for law not externally imposed, the same ache expressed by Eileen Dovney Chunnell and by Sean O'Connell in the 17th century. And in 1828 at Cumachiste, Tomás Rua was exuberantly confident that the time for the change in that law had arrived. Let me leave abstraction, return to factual observations of Daniel O'Connell in the place he most loved to be. In 1844, William O'Neill Daunt, close confidant and later biographer of the Liberator, visited Derrynane, and soon after 6 in the morning towards Cumachiste again. We ascended the hill of Cumachiste, crossed the line of the new road, and ere half an hour had elapsed, a hare was started. There was that finest of all music, the loud, full cry of the beagles, returned by 1,000 echoes, the shouts of men and boys ringing sharply and cheerily along the hills. And there was Daniel O'Connell himself, equaling in agility men not half his age, pouring forth an exhaustless stream of jest and anecdote. The postboy arrived with a letter bag while we were at breakfast. Mr. O'Connell read his letters on the mountain. The hunt was then resumed, and with such success that, if I mistake not, we brought home 7 hares at sunset. Sean O'Fuelan used this passage in his wonderful biography of O'Connell, King of the Beggars. It was also used by Walter Mackin in his novel The Silent People, and indeed myself as part of a poem series about O'Connell. But I would like to finish with a passage written by someone who I'm sure knew O'Connell better than anybody I have so far quoted. And again, its setting is Cumachiste. In 1849, 2 years after the Liberator's death, his son John published a memoir. Here is an extract. I was alone with him upon a glorious autumn day during the recess at 1835, at the very pinnacle of Cumachiste, the high mountain over which the road from Cahirsiveen to Derrynane then traversed, and around which the present road passes. The truly magnificent panorama of the mountain, promontory and islet, wild bay and illimitable ocean lay before us in all its sublimity. Deeply engaged in thought as he was, I could not restrain myself for interrupting him with an expression of admiration. He joined in it and then added, "Fiach, fiach, fiachanish." See now, there's the hair master, there's the hair, half whispered, half screamed a ragged urchin jumping down between us from the crag, top of the crag. Away went my father, and away to the winds went the deep thought which a moment before had been beaming from his glance and just breathing from his lips, and it was lost to me forever. As indeed it is lost to us today. But I hope that what I have touched on this morning will perhaps help us guess what it was the Liberator was about to say before he strode down from Kumikishta into history. Thank
you very much, Paddy. I think we have a couple of minutes, 5 minutes or so for a few questions. Anyone would like to ask Fiona or Paddy a question? Well, I was going to say, I mean, everyone's looking towards lunch. No questions for the moment. I might just ask a question, Fiona. Just interested about, mentioning, the rural, the urban, and the fact that some of the writers have moved, obviously, to Dublin. No bias here. But I'm just interested in how that, I suppose, the negotiation between the urban and the rural plays itself out in those works you mentioned.
It certainly does in Pauline's work. She would have, as well as some of the plays that she has set, and I suppose the majority of her plays are set in her local area here around Cahirsiveen. She does write one play that's set in Dublin, and it's set in a house. It's called The Stars Are Nigh, and it was rejected by the Abbey, but I can see why it was very, very overwritten. But anyhow, she sets it in a house, a lodging house, and it's where women are staying. So again, even though it's an urban setting, I feel she was very, very much ahead of her time, and she was just using those few years in Dublin and bringing them back with her and bringing what she had learned in the department to be able to negotiate, I suppose, still the urban-rural divide here in Cahirsiveen.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? Okay, we might just, right, one quick question. Go ahead, sir. Thanks, Mary. This gentleman.
Paddy, excellent talk. I was very recently reading the biography of Daniel O'Connell from 10 plus years ago, and I was amazed at how the transport worked in the time, and he was a very good horse rider. And I was wondering if there was anything in the records or literature left behind. Apparently he rode from Cardonal or Derrynane up to Corkcase in Cork through the night once. The horse allegedly collapsed and died on arrival. Is there much to, was everybody a good horse rider back then, or is there much about that aspect of his life?
Yeah, well, it's not an area I would know an awful lot about. I mean, I'm not a historian, but there are a lot, as you said, of accounts of visitors arriving there, sort of shell-shocked, usually from the Kenmare side. There are, in folklore, there's always the story that when he would come to towards Kumikishta from the Waterville side, that the people of Loher would all come out and pull his carriage up. I think anybody who has looked at the old road going up there, the Kerry Way, would imagine that is definitely folklore, because it wouldn't have been possible. But yeah, I mean, Derrynane was a very remote place. He had to be well used to horse traveling, for his lawyerly work in his early years in Tralee and so forth. And its remoteness was part of why I think there's an account of, I can't remember who the historian was, but perhaps Murish would know, somebody visiting Hunting Cap, I think, and saying he wanted to write about Derrynane, and he was saying, please don't. Our strength here is our remoteness, how nobody knows about us, and leave us where we are. So, I think that sense of remoteness and the density of community which would go along with that certainly helped to form O'Connell, but it's something that he would have continually had to work against in his younger days. But then, we must remember when he became established and became Member of Parliament, all sorts of things, he lived in Dublin. So, it was just Derrynane for the only time he could depend on it, as far as I know, was September. And, I've quoted a passage there about him hating to leave it. There are umpteen letters that I know of like that he hated to leave. I'm not sure if that answered what you were saying.
Thank you for your question. I can see Mary's eager to get up here. Apologies. I suppose all that remains is to join me in sincerely thanking our fantastic speakers, Fiona and Paddy. Thank you very much.
Now, just some brief housekeeping, and to announce also that we have a small change to the programme, and it gives me great pleasure to announce that Helena Mary Kettleborough is joining us today to launch a very special book written by her mother, and it's written about a place dear to my heart, Kells, as my family, the Healys, lived there or born there, and I was born there. So it's a very beautiful place, you all know. And the book is about Kells. So it's a real read. I haven't read it yet, I have to admit, but Philomena and Christy tell me they have, and it's a wonderful read. It's called 3 Days of Summer. So this will be launched at 1:40. So if you wouldn't mind returning for that launch, we'd all be very grateful. Can I also take the opportunity to thank Leonard, Dimitri, and Stephen for welcoming us here this morning, and also to thank our wonderful guests from the Ukraine who allowed us to have their space for today, and what a warm welcome they all gave us this morning. But I just want to say a huge thank you for the hospitality and the care and the wonderful welcome they gave us, and we just want to say thank you back. I suppose what touched me deeply this morning was that compared to a year ago, it was really like walking into somebody's home. The interaction between Leonard and all the residents and Stephen and the kids going off to school, and just what Norma was saying earlier about how suddenly, they were part of Cahirsiveen and part of this community, and there's great credit due to everybody involved in that. So I felt very privileged to witness it this morning. I also want to thank James. James has been with us for the last 10 years looking after our sound. And I suppose to me, anyway, it's the most important aspect of our school. It certainly wouldn't be the success it is without such professionals looking after it. So a big thank you. So now you have the opportunity to have lunch either here in the hotel or to walk uptown. And we're just asking you all again to return at 1:40. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We will, as I said, I'd like to just add this item to our program, and that is we're not quite launching this book. We'll probably do that next year, but given the fact that it was completed recently and is written, as I said, by a lady who lived a lot of her life in Kells, and as I said, is related to Eamon Langford, which is my easiest way of introducing this lady to you. I only met her for the first time yesterday, but of course Eamon Langford I knew very well, and he was a great supporter of the school. And of course, the Murphys, everybody knew the Murphys, they were stuck in everything. And I'd say some of you might even be former students of Breed Langford and the various other members of that family. So what we're going to do is, I'm just going to introduce Catherine. She's going to talk a little bit about what's in the book. I've given her 4 minutes. We're going to take a few photographs for the web, for the internet, and then we will then begin with the Daniel O'Connell lecture, which will be introduced by Ruth Barrington thereafter. And again, just to make the point, those of you who are going up to the church, that there's no bus to the church, but if you need a lift, I'm sure if you let the front desk know, we'll be able to fix you up with something. And secondly, just to remind you again, if you want to watch it online, those of you who are back on, that the lecture in the church, which begins at 3:45, given by myself, properly prepared, not too long, but very interesting. That if you want to follow that you can access it only through the website of the church for obvious reasons. Our webcam doesn't. You can't bilocate. So anyway, so at this point I'll introduce Catherine, and you might like to say a few words. We'll have a few photographs and then we'll go on to the rest of the program. Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's a very great privilege to stand here today. My name is Helena Mary Kettleborough, and I'm the daughter of Catherine Kettleborough, who is née Murphy. And I'd just firstly like to say thank you very much to the Daniel O'Connell School for allowing me to be here today with my mother's book. I'd also like to thank Christy O'Connell, who's Eamon's very good friend, thank him for his support, and thank Maurice Brick and Mary O'Neill in particular. I just want to locate this book, if you will permit me, within the family, because actually this book is a celebration of Kells, County Kerry, but it's a celebration of Cahirsiveen. It's a celebration of the mountains of Dingle. It's a celebration of Dingle Bay. And my mother's mother was Helena Nell Murphy. Some of you may know her or may not have known her. And my mother had a number of very dear sisters, Breed, Helena, Moira, and Ita, and her brother Jackie, who've all predeceased now, and also brother-in-laws Morse and Eamon Langford. My mother's sister Nora is still alive and comes to Kells and Kerry a lot with her husband Phil, and has been very supportive of the book. My mother was also very pleased. She left Ireland in the 1950s, and as you heard this morning, a lot of Irish people left. And so although my mother lived all her life in England, this was where her heart was, and she's captured that in her book. But she was always thrilled that her nieces and nephews continue to live in Ireland and abroad. And Ita Ryan, who's her niece, and now lives in Kells with her husband and 2 wonderful children, is here today. So thank you very much. I just want to say a little bit about the book. This is a beautiful picture. Some of you can see it. It's of Dingle Bay and the mountains. And the picture was actually taken by my partner, Phil Barton, who's in the audience, and he was very instrumental in making this book a reality. My mother finished the book in 1974, but for various reasons it was never published. Her first book was published by Faber and Faber in 1967, and then for her 90th birthday, we published it. So my mother lived to see it and to touch it and to hold it, which was really lovely. Very sadly, because of COVID, we didn't actually have our small launch party. But the reason why I'm so proud of it, I know I would be as a daughter, but when you read it, it's a celebration of here, of Kerry. It's a celebration of friendship. It's a celebration of family relationships. And it's a celebration of the mountains and the sea. And although all of you who live, I thought the introduction about Daniel O'Connell, he was rooted in this area, which gave him his strength. And I hope you feel that those of you who'd like to get a copy of the book, that actually my mother was rooted in this lovely area. And I do hope you like the title. I remember very vividly, there was another title for the book, which was called All Things Remain. But we decided, you know, you could have a lot of jokes about that. So we decided, or my mother decided, that 3 Days of Summer was what she'd call the book. And I just want to finish by saying we're hoping that Quirks might take the book. So if we sell out there, do think of buying a copy, but maybe they'll be there in quotes. And the other final point I want to make was my mother had a very great sense of spirit and spirituality. And in this book is some of her sense of spirit, which she got from the mountains and the sea and her community. And so I hope you will enjoy reading it. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we should take a photograph before we'll just take a photograph. I'm getting very vain. People, always with the better word, always the better word. Right. Phil? Come up here again.
Yeah, yes, that would be lovely. Yeah, that would be lovely.
Phil, you come in, come on. I feel really stupid.
Just smile, Hirsch.
I feel really.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We all
very
look
much.
happy anyway.
Now, at this stage, I'll call Ruth up and she'll introduce the afternoon session. And just to say that I hope we'll see you in the church at 4:45 sharp, because there's another event out in the field after that. So we'll try and keep everything to the timetable, which means I will shut up. Thank you.
Thanks, Maurice, for marking my cards as chair. It's my great pleasure to introduce what is the keynote address of the Daniel O'Connell School, the Daniel O'Connell Lecture. Maurice mentioned first thing this morning that we're celebrating our 10th anniversary of the Daniel O'Connell School. And as those of you, and many of you have attended all, and certainly many of them will know that the theme of the past 10 years has been around the decade of commemoration. And each year at the school, we have chosen a theme to explore and commemorate with, of course, Kerry as a core, and Daniel O'Connell, of relevance to Daniel O'Connell as well. So this year, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Owen O'Shea to deliver the Daniel O'Connell Lecture. And Owen is going to reflect on what we have learnt from the decade of commemorations. And I have to say, Owen is really very well qualified to address this task. He is a regular attendee at the school, and in 2021, he delivered a fascinating talk about the role of the newspapers in Kerry during the Civil War. And those of you who are here, I know, will have appreciated that talk very much. He is a historian of note. He's an author of a number of books, including No Middle Path, The Civil War in Kerry, Vying for Victory, research on the 1923 election, for which I believe his research was awarded PhD, and a book on the Ballymacandie, the story of a Kerry ambush. When he's not busy researching important themes in history, his job is media, communications and customer relations officer with Kerry County Council. So it's my great pleasure to invite Owen to deliver this year's Daniel O'Connell Lecture.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Ruth, for the kind introduction. If you might indulge me just for a brief moment at the beginning, I would like to acknowledge, if I may, the passing in recent days of Sean O'Sullivan of Kilortlin, who was a founder of the Kerry Way, among other things, but was also a historian of note and an instrumental figure in the Kilortlin History and Folklore Society. So I just wanted to, on all our behalves, extend our condolences to Sean and his family. It's a great honour and privilege to be here this afternoon to offer a reflection on the decade of centenaries, which has recently drawn to a close. I'm very grateful for the invitation and to have the opportunity to offer my own reflections on the commemorations of the centenaries of the last number of years, and to offer some thoughts from a number of different perspectives. By doing so, I hope to generate discussion and debate about remembering and forgetting during a period in which we marked a series of formative milestones in our nation's history. I have been fortunate to have been involved in and viewed the decade of centenaries from several perspectives, be it as a participant, as a journalist, through my work with Kerry County Council, or as someone who has researched, studied and written about the period for many years. Now that the decade of centenaries has come to an end, it is a good time, I think, to pause and reflect on the period, to consider what we have done well, what we have done not so well, to look at what we have remembered and what perhaps we have forgotten, whether intentionally or otherwise. My focus is on Kerry, where there were probably more commemorations over the past decade than in most other counties, while referencing some of the major national themes of the period in question. In speaking about commemorations, I think that language is important. And I came across a definition that I like, and which I found on the Northern Ireland Creative Centenaries website, and I think it's a very good summary of the correct approach and of the way in which much of the decade of centenaries was conducted. It states that commemoration marks out the special from the ordinary, or the extraordinary from the everyday, and acts of commemoration are about retaining in the memory, or committing to the memory, events, developments, and people from the past. For me, the most important word in that definition is memory, and the most important aspect of the decade of centenaries has been the commitment to memory, our individual memories and the collective memory of the events of a century ago. For me, it's more about commemoration as remembering, rather than commemoration as celebrating, which can sometimes involve unnecessary or inappropriate triumphalism or glorification. The decade of centenaries has involved the act of consciously remembering what occurred during this turbulent time in our history by discussing, researching, portraying, presenting, discovering and exploring. And I want to consider today how well we have done any and all of this in County Kerry. I think it's useful to mention also the overarching objective of the advisory group for the decade of centenaries, which was set up by the government back in 2011. And the aim of the programme, which was overseen by that advisory group, was to remember appropriately, proportionately, respectfully, and with sensitivity. And they also spoke about the need to develop a deeper understanding of the period, as well as recognising that there are many different narratives and memories involved. And I think that's a useful summary of what the state programme set out to achieve, and it's a useful benchmark, if you like, against which to test the commemorations which took place in Kerry over the past decade. I'd like to talk first about some of the milestones during the decade of centenaries in Kerry before going on to look at some of the main themes which emerged. Throughout the decade, though the decade, officially began in 2012 to coincide with the centenary of the passage of the Third Home Rule Bill, it was really only 4 years later before there were any significant commemorative events in Kerry. The commemoration of the Easter Rising was perhaps the most straightforward of the period during the decade. It was a quite simple narrative around the telling of the story of the Rising, the centrality of the proclamation, the role of and the execution of the leaders, and in a Kerry context, the role of key local figures as well as key events at Banna, Ballycassan, Valentia and elsewhere. I had the honour of being Master of Ceremonies for the state commemoration at Banna in April 2016. It was a tremendous honour to play a small part in what was a truly remarkable occasion, not least because it was the only official 1916 commemoration to have taken place outside of Dublin, at which the President of Ireland was in attendance. And a few things remain with me from that day, not least the reenactment of Casement's speech from the dock, which was delivered by Declan McCarthy from Skibbereen, and a performance of Roisin Dubh by Shem Satira. The Navy ship, the Ellie Niamh, was anchored just off the shore, and there was a fly past by the Air Corps, which was timed to coincide with the conclusion of the national anthem. And the way in which the national anthem was sung that day sticks out in my mind particularly. And I think that during the 1916 commemorations and the decade generally, people took great pride in Amhrán na Bhíon and sang it with greater gusto. And I think one of the minor but important legacies of the decade is the renewed interest in our national anthem and the rescuing of the soldiers' song from being mumbled on the terraces at sporting events to making it more meaningfully and consciously associated with the course of our history. The outstanding success of the 1916 commemorations in Kerry and countrywide was that they were community-led, with the support of local authorities around the country. There was probably no town or village in Kerry which did not have its own commemoration. The 1916 proclamation was read, parades and exhibitions were held, and new monuments, many of them featuring a replica of the proclamation, were installed. This was complemented by more formal elements, such as the development of the Roger Casement exhibition at the Kerry County Museum, which was visited by President Higgins, as well as the publication of new books and other works on this period in Kerry and beyond. One final and very valuable aspect of the 1916 commemorations was the initiative of the Irish Army to visit every primary school in the country to deliver the national flag and a copy of the proclamation, and which involved 10,000 members of the Defence Forces. This very much whetted the appetite of the younger generation to learn more about our history and to pursue projects and displays in the corridors of our schools. In fact, one of the great achievements of the decade generally has been in the involvement of our schools and teachers, particularly at primary level, in fostering a greater interest in the history of the period, particularly local history. In 2017, there were a number of commemorations for the centenary of the death of Thomas Ashe, who died while being force-fed while on hunger strike. A beautiful new memorial was erected in his native Kennard, and there was a commemoration and parade held in Tralee, which was addressed by relatives of Thomas Ashe. And of course, the Ashe Memorial Hall in Tralee, one of the county's finest buildings, was rededicated by Kerry County Council to his name and in his honour. The next most significant event in the period was in 2018-19, when the centenary of the 1918 general election and the formation of the first Dáil in January 1919 was marked. In Kerry, there was an exhibition hosted by Kerry Library, which honoured the county's first 4 TDs, those who had been elected at the December 1918 election and who became members of the first Dáil. These were Fionn Lynch from this part of the county, of course, along with Piers Beasley, James Crowley and Austin Stack. And for the first time ever, the descendants and families of the 4 TDs, pictured here, were brought together in one room, and they spoke very movingly about their relatives who had played such a key role in the campaign for Irish independence. Like the commemorations of 1916, the War of Independence offered communities in Kerry the opportunity to honour those who had participated in the fight for Irish freedom. Each of the significant ambushes from the period was marked, as were many of the key figures who were killed in the 1919-21 period. All of this prompted a renewed interest among families and communities about what had occurred in their own localities, and there was a renewed sense of pride among the descendants of those who had been injured and killed in the fighting. With the exception of the furore over a proposed commemoration for the RIC, which I'll reference later, this period of the commemorations passed largely without controversy. It was a binary, largely uncomplicated period which was being remembered. One of the very welcome aspects of the centenary of the War of Independence was the coming together of the relatives and descendants of those from both sides of the conflict. This is a picture of Mary O'Neill and Dermot Cotter. They're standing outside the ruins of a house at Ballymaccandy, a small townland between Milltown and Castlemaine, and the location of an ambush in June 1921, the story of which I published 2 years ago. Mary O'Neill's grandfather was RIC Sergeant James Collery, a father of 8 young children who lived in Milltown, and who was one of those killed in the Ballymacandie ambush. Dermot Cotter's grandfather, Jerry Unkie O'Connor, was one of the IRA men involved, and he threw the grenade which killed Sergeant Collery. Mary and Dermot had never met each other before the centenary of the ambush, but they came together, had a long chat, and were interviewed by the nationwide programme on RTE. Though there was a mutual appreciation of the role of Sergeant Collery and Unkie O'Connor in the ambush, there was also an acknowledgement by both Mary and Dermot that they had very different perspectives on the events of 1921. Mary reflecting on the trauma of her widowed grandmother, Dermot expressing pride in his grandfather's republicanism and his role in the struggle for Irish freedom. The meeting, however, highlighted the capacity of commemoration to facilitate conciliation or reconciliation. But it was also a reminder that in all of the controversy about the commemoration of the RIC, which I'll refer to shortly, the type of ordinary individuals who were caught up in the War of Independence and their families were often forgotten and ignored as contemporary political sparring got in the way. The commemoration of the events of the Civil War in Kerry was always going to be challenging and potentially fraught. There was certainly a nervousness in political circles and at a local level about the potential for reopening old wounds. But the commemoration of the most dreadful episodes of the war, particularly those of March 1923, was dignified and respectful. It has been noted that there were 5 or 6 different commemorations held at Ballyseedy in March of this year, organised by political parties and by non-aligned organisations such as the Kerry Archaeological and Historical Society. Disappointment was expressed in some quarters that there could not have been one single unified commemoration, and perhaps that did something of a disservice to those who were being remembered. But there will perhaps always be different interpretations and commemorations of this divisive episode, which leaves a very deep scar in our county. Notably, there was just one commemoration at Knocknagoshel, which was organised by the Kerry Archaeological and Historical Society. Although what was noteworthy was that both traditions and the descendants on those of both sides of the fratricide were present there, and indeed at Ballyseedy too. Who would have thought even a decade ago that a Sinn Féin leader would have laid a wreath at the memorial at Knocknagoshel? Or who would have thought that Fine Gael politicians would have attended a commemoration at Ballyseedy? It was a measure, I think, of how far we have moved on politically. Though various parties of various traditions continue to lay claim to the events of March 1923, there is a respectful acceptance that the pain and suffering of this dreadful period is only exacerbated by the type of unseemly political jostling over the dead of Kerry, which occurred so often in the past. If I could humbly mention the conference which I was involved in organising and which was held in February of this year with the support of Decade of Centenaries funding, and which I think facilitated a mature and reflective discussion on the Civil War in Kerry and its legacy, by bringing together academics, historians and experts on a variety of themes to tease out the issues of 100 years ago. Given the attendance and level of interest at the talks, roundtable discussions and other events, it proved not only that an appetite for history and knowledge exists, but that there is also an appetite for that history and knowledge when it is well presented and with due regard to the nuances, contradictions and complexities of the period. To move on to some of the other developments or themes of the Decade of Centenaries in Kerry, one of the interesting developments was the erection of new monuments in the county, or the restoration of existing ones. Monuments, of course, continue to be a feature of commemoration in Ireland, and during the centenary of the War of Independence and the Civil War, they remained a key focal point for many events. Perhaps one of the finest examples of new memorials in the county is the monument in Killorglin to the 3 men who drowned at Ballykassan on Good Friday in 1916. And the deaths of Charles Monaghan, Dan Sheehan and Con Keating were also remembered during a commemoration at Ballykassan Pier. Another of the new monuments from the period is the memorial at Valentia Island to mark the sending of the message from the local cable station to the United States, to alert Irish America to the news that the Easter Rising had begun, and which was unveiled by members of the Ring family. There was restoration work undertaken in recent years on the Headford Junction monument, which of course commemorates the largest single incident in Kerry during the War of Independence. And earlier this year, a new monument was erected in Knocknagoshel to the memory of Dan Murphy, who was shot dead by the Free State Army for his alleged role in the assembly of the bomb, which was used to kill their peers at Barranarrig Wood. One of the major deficits in memorial terms in Kerry, I would argue, is the absence of monuments or crosses to the memory of the Free State dead, despite the fact that more Free State Army fatalities occurred in Kerry than those on the anti-treaty side. There are two notable exceptions, including here on the right, the memorial to the O'Connor-Scarteen brothers, which is probably better described as a headstone than a memorial, as it stands over their grave in Kinmare. Better known, perhaps, is the monument to the 5 Free State soldiers who were killed at Knocknagoshel in 1923, and which was first unveiled near the village in 2013. The Knocknagoshel monument has had a controversial history. Though it was only unveiled 10 years ago, it has twice been vandalised. Notably, the vandalism was condemned by those in all political parties at the time. But there was something of a sinister history of this nature dating back much further. One of the resting places of the Knocknagoshel dead was very badly damaged in October 1925. The grave of Paddy Pats O'Connor, one of those killed, was defaced and damaged, having recently been erected by his family at a cost of £120. Proof, if it were needed, that the visceral hatreds which the Civil War provoked ran deep and endured long after the war itself had ended. Having looked at some of the events, memorials and themes of the period, I'd like to propose some of the successes and failures of the decade of centenaries in the county. The most positive and impactful legacy of the decade, in my opinion, has been the ongoing digitisation of and the increased accessibility of archive material. Principal among these are the records contained in the Military Service Pension Collection, and which now includes over 1,200 accounts from Kerry, with more to come. The files include applications for allowances, pensions and compensation from the surviving combatants and the dependents of those killed, the majority of which were refused because the eligibility bar was set so high. The great benefit of what is now so readily available through the collection is that the testimonies and accounts contained therein include the entire period from 1916 to 23, including, very importantly, the Civil War. Whereas the witness statements collected by the Bureau of Military History in the 1940s and 50s do not address the period after the truce, the records in the Military Service Pension Collection do. And the fact that the pensions collection is now substantially available online makes this archive readily available and very searchable on our laptops from the comfort of our couches and kitchen tables. The collection is quite extraordinary as an archive of first-hand accounts for the period. And I've spent several years, much to the detriment of my eyesight, reading the pension applications of combatants, including members of the Volunteers, the IRA, Fianna Éireann and Cumann na mBan, as well as soldiers in the Free State Army and their families. Few of these ever featured or haven't featured in the historiography of the period heretofore. Because of the ready availability of this sort of material now, we can move beyond the rhetoric and orations at gravesides and commemorations and read the accounts of the protagonists themselves. We can, for example, learn more about the incredible suffering and poverty among Republicans in the years after the Revolution, including, for example, Michael O'Connell of Castleisland, who wrote about being starving in the 1930s because he couldn't get a pension. We learn, for example, of the severe mental and psychological torment of women like Molly O'Shea, whose sister George was killed at Ballyseedy, and the testimony here from Stephen Fuller describing her mental incapacity. Or, for example, the horrific injuries and trauma of Ty Coffey, the sole survivor of Countess Bridge, who confided in a doctor in the 1930s when he lived in New York, and who described how he was suffering from neurasthenia, or what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also, though, a significant counterbalance, I think, in the pensions to the predominantly Republican narrative of events during the Civil War in Kerry, particularly in relation to the immense hardship and suffering of Free State Army survivors and their dependents, something which I've detailed in my own book on the Civil War in the county. For example, the plight of Private Joseph O'Brien, whose legs were blown off at Knocknagoshel and who spent years begging the government for help. These are from his file, which detail how his wife had to carry him up and down the stairs because the department wouldn't supply him with a wheelchair. Or, for example, the pitiful life of Kathleen Horan, the widow of Free State Army soldier John Joe Horan from Tralee, who begged successive governments for help and pleaded with Eamon de Valera to put her children into an orphanage because she couldn't afford to feed or clothe them. Or the Free State Army widows of those killed in Kerry, often left deeply impoverished and often forgotten by the state, which their husbands had fought to defend. These are just some of the accounts that portray vividly and shockingly the enormous toll of this period, and which are now being appreciated, I would suggest, and considered properly for the first time. In relation to archive material held locally, and in the same vein, I would draw your attention to an excellent resource for the period, which was published a few years ago by Kerry Library. It was compiled by the historian in residence, Tom Dillon, who is speaking in Derrynane tomorrow. And it includes a comprehensive list of sources and items in collections in Kerry and in national repositories, which relates to the history of Kerry between 1919 and 23. Another very exciting aspect of the decade of centenaries has been an engagement with memorabilia and artifacts from the period. For too long, items like medals, letters, uniforms, and other personal items were left hiding and gathering dust in biscuit tins or shoeboxes under beds or on the top of the press in the kitchen. And this is, for example, a Cumann pin, which was presented to Kathleen Hannafin of Fairies and which turned up just recently and is being reunited with her family. In a similar vein, but on the other side of the War of Independence conflict, I came across an item belonging to Sergeant James Collery of the RIC, who I mentioned earlier. And this is his swagger stick, which is still held privately in a collection in Milltown, where he served as a sergeant, and a swagger stick was an ornamental piece worn on parade. And you can see the RIC emblem embossed there at the top of the stick. One of the most evocative artifacts from the period in Kerry is the shirt worn by Stephen Fuller on the night he was blown up by the mine at Ballyseedy, and which emerged during the decade of centenaries. The shirt, which is marked by the grit and shrapnel which was embedded in Fuller's back as he was blown up, was kept in the Dawley home in Knocknagoshel in Fairies for decades afterwards. That was the home where Fuller was kept for a time after the explosion. It's now in the custody of the Kerry County Museum, and as Helen O'Carroll of the museum said recently, it's a more powerful artifact than any of the gallons of ink that have been spilled in books and newspaper articles about Ballyseedy over the past 100 years. Items such as this make historical episodes all the more tangible, however shocking or moving they may be. Another very welcome and positive feature of the decade of centenaries in Kerry has been significant engagement by the arts community in creative portrayals of the events and people of this time, beginning during the 1916 commemorations and led by the Arts Office of Kerry County Council. As the Kerry Civil War Conference earlier this year, for example, there was this incredible display by students from the Munster Technological University and Kerry College, in which the students selected stories and figures from the Civil War and represented those in various art forms. The results were quite extraordinary. So, for example, here on the left, we have a portrayal of Sally Sheehy of Borby in Tralee, who was a senior figure in Cumann, and on the right is a portrayal of the physical injuries sustained by Stephen Fuller at Ballyseedy. The exhibition was widely praised and appreciated by everyone who attended the conference. Drama has also been used to great effect during the past decade. An outstanding piece of theatre was Patrick, which was written by Aidan O'Connor and which was based on the story of Patrick O'Connor from Rathmore, who died during the Easter Rising in Dublin. And if I could be so bold as to reference my own play on the Ballymacandie ambush, which was staged this time last year in Milltown, and which featured a cast of over 20 locals who had never been on the stage before. Most importantly and memorably from my point of view, it was seen by first-generation descendants of many of those who featured in the ambush. But more than that, it brought to life a story in a different way, a story that few people in the locality had ever even heard of. In a similar vein, I want to mention the staging of Hunger Strike, which Fiona spoke about this morning, and which involving a wonderful cast who were able to bring to the stage for the first time a play which was written by Maureen Cregan, a native of Killorglin, and which was a hugely evocative portrayal of the events of this period. And of course, at this very time, 100 years ago, thousands of Republican prisoners were on hunger strike in prisons around the country, including local TD Tomás O'Donoghue from Renard. The centenaries also helped to raise awareness of the profile of the existing corpus of literature on the revolutionary period in Kerry, particularly from those who were directly involved in the combat, including, for example, the work of Niall Harrington, one of the few Free State Army accounts from the period, and those of Seamus O'Connor, Jeremiah Murphy, Billy Mullins, and others from the IRA perspective. Dorothy McCardle's Tragedies of Kerry from 1924 is, of course, a one-sided account of the events of the Civil War in Kerry, and it remains a totemic work for Republicans. But from a historical perspective, it remains one of the most important works on the conflict in Kerry, featuring, as it does, accounts gathered directly by McCardle from the relatives of those who died. Finally, in terms of different means of portraying events, there were a number of very good documentaries and programs presented on television in recent years, which I won't detail here. But in terms of what occurred in Kerry, Pat Butler's seminal 1997 docudrama Ballyseedy remains the only televisual portrayal of the massacre at Ballyseedy. Thankfully, we were able to present a special screening of the film at the Civil War conference back in February. But despite Pat Butler's efforts and those of others, RTE sadly chose not to rebroadcast the piece on the centenary of these events. It remains a very shocking but an incredibly balanced evocation of what occurred in March 1923, devoting as much time to the events at Knocknagoshel as it does to the explosion at Ballyseedy. So, if we have managed to achieve all of what I have set out and more, what are the issues or themes that we have failed to remember and failed to commemorate, whether consciously or inadvertently? We haven't appropriately remembered the ordinary rank and file of the Royal Irish Constabulary. The government's cack-handed approach to commemorating the RIC some years ago came at the significant cost to our understanding and remembering of the ordinary members of the force. It meant that the lives and stories of the rank and file of the RIC was not adequately remembered or explored. What the controversy also caused was the conflating of the reign of terror of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries with the ordinary Irishmen who were members of Ireland's police force at the time, and who as a result, hardly featured in the commemorative programme. The picture here is of RIC members outside Milltown RIC barracks in 1914, which is taken from the cover of my book on the Ballymacandie ambush. In the same way as there was no appetite to commemorate the RIC, so too has there been very little appetite to remember or commemorate those who served in the Free State Army. In Kerry, this is the case probably more so than any other county. In a county in which Republican prisoners were brutally tortured and summarily murdered in such large numbers by the Kerry command of the army, this is perhaps very understandable. But as I said in an address at Knocknagoshel back in March, should the sadistic behaviour of Paddy O'Daly and others, who presided over a regime of terror here in Kerry in 1923, mean that the many young men from Kerry and beyond who served in the army and fought to defend the new state against the anti-treaty IRA are forgotten forevermore and written out of our history? This is Stephen Canty from Causeway. He's one of the 31 Free State Army soldiers from Kerry who died during the Civil War. Stephen Canty was killed in Ennis in County Clare in April 1922. He was one of the many Kerry men who enlisted in the army, whether through political conviction or whether they wanted to serve the new state, or whether they simply wanted to get a decent job to support their families. Whatever their motivations, they were no less valid or legitimate as those who took up arms against the new state. Who are we to judge at this remove? And yet there is no monument or memorial to Private Stephen Canty or the 30 other Kerry natives who lost their lives during the Civil War. The brutal regime of Paddy O'Daly and his peers cast a long shadow, long enough to have obliterated from our history the stories of the ordinary Kerrymen who fought in the army of the fledgling Irish state. We have finally, as a nation, begun to remember and honour the role of women during the Irish Revolutionary period. This is due to efforts of many historians and researchers, some of them from Kerry, including my good friend Dr. Mary McAuliffe, and who have for the first time brought the stories of women from this seminal period to the fore. One aspect of that story is the critical role played by members of Cumann na mBan, who for decades were not considered combatants in the same way as men. But we are finally beginning to acknowledge the fact that these women were an integral part of the revolution, often putting their lives on the line, placing themselves at great personal risk, participating in very dangerous activities, and often suffering great physical and psychological trauma in later years. A few years ago, I delved into the story of one Cumann na mBan branch in my part of the county, Kilgobnet, near Beaufort. I won't go into their stories here because time doesn't allow, but for the first time now, and thanks to the accounts in the military archives, their involvement can be fully appreciated. Just as an example, Joan O'Brien here in the centre used to eavesdrop on the Black and Tans as they drank in O'Shea's bar in Calordlan. And for her troubles, she was burned out of her home and forced to move here to Cahirsiveen. She went on hunger strike for several weeks when she was jailed during the Civil War. Have we adequately commemorated women like Joan O'Brien and Cumann na mBan in Kerry and the role of women generally in this period? The answer to that question is no. Nowhere in Kerry is there a memorial to the women who joined the organisation and who participated in the revolutionary period. Thankfully, that is now being addressed to some extent with a proposal put forward recently by the 5 female members of Kerry County Council to develop a permanent memorial to the members of Cumann na mBan in the county, which is a very welcome initiative. More needs to be done here, however. What of the civilian women who were so impacted by the violence of the time? The McCarthy sisters of Kinmare, brutally assaulted and humiliated by Paddy O'Daly and his men at their home in the town just a few weeks after the end of the Civil War. Their assault was a largely forgotten addendum to the story of Free State Army brutality in Kerry. If the McCarthy sisters were men, would there have been a commemoration last summer or a memorial event in their name? There is now a memorial plaque to another civilian, Hannah Carey, a waitress at the Imperial Hotel in Killarney who was shot dead on the 11th of July 1921, just a few minutes before the truce came into effect, bestowing on her the unfortunate distinction of being the very last person killed in Ireland's War of Independence. But it is a very rare example of memorials to women killed, injured, or affected by the revolution in Ireland. Many civilians died in Kerry between 1916 and 1923. 14 civilians died in Kerry during the Civil War, for example, among them 3 civilians from my home village of Milltown. Jeremiah Hannafin, pictured here, was shot dead by a passing Free State Army patrol, which was passing his home on the road to Killarney. Earlier this year, the community erected a simple memorial to his memory, and that of Mary and Jeremiah McKenna, who were killed in similar circumstances. My point being is that the story of the wars in Ireland in this period remains dominated by the stories of the combatants, often at the expense of the stories of civilian casualties, which cannot be forgotten and which remain an under-remembered cohort during the decade of centenaries. Are there other things we could have done better, or are there people and events that we have left out? The role of Labour and the Labour Party in Kerry during the period remains to be fully considered. The Labour movement locally has been the subject of limited study, but is ripe for more. Similarly, the Farmers' Party and agrarian politics at this time has been largely absent from the commemorations landscape in Kerry. Both Labour and the Farmers stood aside at the 1922 election in Kerry, but they both contested the important 1923 election and had a significant impact on politics in the county in this period. Exceptional work has been done by people like Dr. Richard McElligott on the role of the GAA in these years, and particularly how it helped to heal divisions after the Civil War. But the role of other sporting and civic groups was important too, and has not been the subject of much local study or commemoration. There has been limited focus on the role of the Catholic Church, which was deeply hostile to the IRA during the Civil War in Kerry. But there was a recent conference on this period in Dublin recently, and the Catholic Primate, Eamon Martin, did acknowledge the hurt caused by the Bishop's Pastoral of 1922, which is a welcome contribution, I believe, to the promotion of healing 100 years on. Though the state commemorations were largely led by political figures, a prime example you'll remember being the joint oration at Bain Leblaw last year involving Leo Varadkar and Micheál Martin, I believe much more could have been done politically to talk about and acknowledge the hurt of this period in Ireland. There has not been, as far as I'm aware, any statements or debate in the Dáil about the Civil War and its traumatic legacy. Arguments about correcting the Dáil record on Ballyseedy, I would argue, are a bit of a political sideshow. Richard Mulcahy cannot, after all, come back into the Dáil to retract the lies he told about Ballyseedy. As was suggested at our recent conference on the Civil War, however, the statements of Stephen Fuller and others affected by Ballyseedy could have and should have been read into the Dáil record this year as a counterbalance to the deceit of 1923. I believe that our political leaders and our national parliament should have heard statements on the War of Independence and the Civil War and could have read into the record for posterity some of the deeply saddening and evocative accounts of the combatants on all sides of the various conflicts, some of which I cited earlier. There was also a missed opportunity for the government to meaningfully address how the state and successive governments failed to support combatants and their families, how the state and society forced thousands of Republicans, men and women, overseas through immigration because they were denied work after the Civil War, how the state failed adequately to support IRA widows and put them through a bureaucratic nightmare of a pensions process, how the state failed in so many cases to support Free State Army soldiers and who were demobilized and out of work after the Civil War, and how the families of those killed on the Free State side were denied meaningful financial support for generations. Acknowledgement of these collective political failures would complement some of the healing and closure which the decade of centenaries has brought. In the coming years, there will be other milestones to be marked, and this is just a very random sample. Whether these will be led by a state commemorative programme remains to be seen, but I think now that the model is there, we should consider how we might continue to meaningfully and respectfully mark key milestones in the early years of the new state. Finally, and in conclusion, notwithstanding some of what I've mentioned, my experience and impressions of the decade of centenaries are overwhelmingly positive. Despite the bitter divisions of the past and the many difficult and disturbing aspects of our history, we are now mature enough as a society to remember, and to remember maturely and sensitively. There may be other issues that deserve more remembering, but for the most part, we have achieved much. There has been, for example, a clear benefit in empowering and trusting communities to engage and to commemorate. There is a growing appetite for more local history. And if it's one thing people kept saying to me over the last 10 years, they never taught us this at school. They never taught us local history at school. I wasn't taught about history in my locality when I was growing up. And that appetite is now there, and thankfully that is being addressed through events like this and through publications. But there is certainly more scope, I believe, and I can understand why that was omitted, if you like, from the curriculum for so many decades, because it was hurtful. But there is now a willingness among the younger generation to embrace all of that. There has been significant involvement of schools and education in the Decade of Centenaries programme, as I mentioned, which has been hugely welcome. And as I outlined, the artistic interpretation and portrayal of events has brought stories from this period to a wider audience. There has been a welcome openness to expert history events and conferences, which have been plentiful and very popular. And most crucially, in my view, there has been greater access to newly digitized archive sources which are now available online and which allow people to make up their own minds about these pivotal moments and episodes. The decade of centenaries in Kerry, despite the deep and long-lasting scars of that time and the veil of silence which was brought down on the period for generations, has been marked in a dignified, inclusive and respectful way. Most of all, it has allowed a new generation to embrace the history of the period, unencumbered by the tired and divisive rhetoric and political baggage of the past. When you peel back all the layers of commemorations, orations, parades, unveilings, lectures, and artistic portrayals, we are left with the real stories of the very real people who lived through this tumultuous and traumatic period in the history of Ireland. The decade of centenaries has allowed the stories of those who experienced events to be told in their own words, in a powerful and evocative way, forcing us all to set aside our assumptions and to consider our collective history in a more open, nuanced, complete, and mature way. The most important legacy, then, of the decade of centenaries, one to which we can all continue to contribute, is to continue to read and absorb the accounts of those involved and those affected by the turmoil and trauma of the time. The voices of those who were silent and silenced for so long are now speaking loudly to us from the archives. The most honest and dignified way we can pay tribute to those who gave up their lives and who suffered during the revolutionary period in Kerry is to listen to, but more importantly, to hear what those accounts have to say. Thank you. All right for time, am I?
Owen, thank you very much indeed for a really comprehensive, reflective and thought-provoking presentation on this decade of commemoration, focusing on Kerry, but I think it's really relevant for the whole country and the whole decade. So we do have a time for questions, for comments. I see one hand up here, Mary. So please put up your hand. We have to bring the mic to you because remember we have people tuning in from around the world and they have to hear the questions too.
Thanks very much, Owen. That's a really good, positive presentation, very thoughtful. And can I recommend Owen's book on the Civil War in Kerry? It's a fantastic read. I wanted to quote Colm Kenny, a historian from DCU, just his perspective on the decade of centenaries. He said that the government approach has been to let sleeping dogs lie, not to cause any offence. He said that some of the events had turned out to be an anodyne affair, rather dull, without much focus or coming down on one side or the other. And he went on to quote the minister, who I think put together the programme for the decade of centenaries. The minister said that the state will not seek to communicate any preferred narrative or make judgments on any persons or actions. And Colm Kenny, a historian, said that this is quite troubling because the minister who said that is a minister in cabinet today, 101 years later, a minister in charge of a state which the anti-treaty side had tried to destroy and smother at birth. So that's Colm Kenny, one historian, his perspective. I'm just wondering if you have your own thoughts or response to that.
I suppose the ultimate statement that the Civil War is over is that the two Civil War parties are now in coalition government together, as has been often said. But I think the state was always going to be faced with a difficulty here in trying to, if you like, oversee or present a programme of centenary events that remained inclusive and remained, I suppose, as unpolitical as possible, if you like. And I think that's why what was so successful is that community-led events were what made the centenaries so special right throughout the period. And I think there was the role of local authorities as well, I think was quite significant. But I think, as I said, there is more that could have been done. I think there was a bit of political nervousness around some of this, particularly around the Civil War. There were a couple of state events around the Civil War, but it was the most painful and difficult period in our history in the last 100 years. And I would suggest maybe a little bit more could have been done and said about all of that. But I don't think I wouldn't necessarily agree that sleeping dogs were let lie. I think people of all generations have embraced the period, have embraced the centennial, and younger people in particular, and I include people younger than myself in that, particularly school children. And I've gone around to do a couple of talks to local primary schools in my area, and young kids now who are 7, 8, 9 years old are absolutely fascinated and enthusiastic about learning more about this period. And they will be coming at that afresh, if you like, without all of that political baggage from the past that I spoke about, and they will read the source material and the archive material rather than relying on maybe historians' opinions, which aren't always sacrosanct.
Yes, Gary, down there. Did I see another hand up here? No.
Thanks, Owen, for that fantastic talk. Could you tell us what explains the parsimonious nature of the Irish state in the 1920s to both Republicans and what we might call Free Staters? You painted a picture of extraordinary parsimony where nobody seems to have got a bob, whether they were on, no matter what side of the Civil War they were on. No, I know we didn't have terribly much money in the state, but there seems to have been a nature often, and these things were often done by, of course, people who never got their hands wet at all in the war, or Civil War or War of Independence.
You're right. One of the reasons, was because the Free State wasn't exactly flush with money, but the eligibility criteria were very restrictive. To prove one's involvement in particular events or in a particular period, it was quite difficult, obviously. You had to go and get testimonies and references, if you like, from the local IRA leader or captain of the local Cumann. Then proving one's financial means or otherwise was obviously quite difficult, unlike today where there are ways and means of doing that. Of course, those on the anti-treaty side weren't included or weren't eligible for pensions until the 1930s when De Valera came to power. And Cumann were only recognised as well in that period. But apart from the parsimonious nature of the whole thing, the bureaucracy around the whole thing was absolutely staggering. Like I've seen letters in some of the archives where widows and families and relatives were still writing letters to TDs in the 1980s and 1990s, trying to resolve, pensions and allowances that their fathers or grandfathers had received, and somebody who was in receipt of a pension was eligible for a grant towards their funeral, for example. And Sally Sheehy, who I mentioned from Tralee, when she passed away in a nursing home in Tralee in 1992, the department refused to pay her funeral grant because they discovered some anomaly from the 70s in which she had accidentally been overpaid her pension by a couple of €100. And so even in the 1990s, which isn't that long ago, people were still going through this bureaucratic nonsense trying to get allowances and payments. But certainly the fact that, and I don't think it's quite right to say that those who, certainly probably a lot of the civil servants processing the claims wouldn't have been involved in getting their hands dirty, so to speak, but there were boards of assessors and there were boards of examiners, which was made up of people who had participated in the various conflicts, who would interrogate and interview people. And a lot of people didn't actually apply for pensions because if you were on the Republican side, you didn't recognise the Free State, so you weren't going to apply for a pension. If you were on the anti-treaty side, then for several years there wasn't, if you were on the Free State side, especially on the army side, there was a recognition, that these men had died in the service of the state, and that was enough for them. But the most powerful, I found reading some of the accounts that are in the military pensions incredibly difficult reading, because they're incredibly eloquent about the poverty that people involved endured, the psychological trauma, the physical injuries, the unemployment, the immigration, the tragedy. And somebody asked me earlier today about whether they can be trusted as a source. On the one hand, these were people applying for a pension, I suppose, and maybe possibly prone to exaggeration, but that can't be the case with all of them. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of applications, and they do detail the type of suffering that I'm talking about. So for that reason, they have to be taken and accepted as a very important statement of how the state and political parties on all sides failed those who had participated in the conflicts.
Thanks, Owen. Yes, please. Just wait for the mic. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Shall I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a most interesting and inspiring presentation. My question is, is there going to be an overall evaluation of the decade of commemorations, which does something like what you did, but does it for a national audience? Because I think it's needed. I think there were political decisions made about things that were not to be looked at or not to be stirred up too much. And I would suggest the nervousness around Northern Ireland in the context of Brexit was part of that. Maybe it was justifiable, but somehow some of those silences need to be broken.
I'm not sure if there will be a formal review, if you like. I know that the Decade of Centenaries and Commemorations unit in the department has been wound up, which suggests that there won't be any. Well, obviously, the Decade of Centenaries was due to finish this year anyway, and after the centenary of the Civil War. But I'd argue that there's probably a role for some sort of formal state-led commemorations of events that are coming, some of which I referenced there a moment ago. But in terms of a formal review, I'm not aware of any, which I think would be useful, and I think it would be useful to hear from, again, the Dáil and a discussion about what we've done well, so that, it's not about a sort of a charge sheet about what we didn't do or haven't done, but I think it's important that we learn from the experience, because in 100 years, there'll be another decade of centenaries, which none of us will be around for. But, it's important that and they will be looking back in 100 years' time at what we've done now. So it's good to review and learn from what we've done, I think.
Perhaps that could be the occasion for some of those statements that you say should have been made that haven't been made. Yes, please.
Yes, I'd like to talk about another civil war that was in Ireland. I'll talk about the North. Recently, last August, I attended the Thomas D'Arcy McGee Summer School. The theme of the conference was the Good Friday Agreement 25 years on. And there seemed to be a strong demand for truth and reconciliation, where the belligerents on both sides could get together and talk about what they had done. Unfortunately, that wasn't done in the Civil War in the South. And I certainly enjoyed your book, No Middle Path. Do you have any strong feelings about that, about truth and reconciliation?
100 years on, I'm not sure. Obviously, none of the people involved are around, but I think that has happened informally. People of, as I mentioned earlier on, people of both traditions or both sides of the Civil War attended commemorations on both sides of the Civil War this year. There is contact between, families who were divided by the Civil War in Kerry, which, people like Paddy Fuller has spoken about. His father Stephen and Paddy Fuller attended the unveiling of the Knocknacoshel Monument in 2013, for example. But I think the truth piece is in the archives I'm talking about, because the truth is the accounts of the people that didn't speak about this or weren't weren't allowed to speak about it for so long. How you'd achieve, I think it's too late now in the time to sort of do a truth and reconciliation piece, but I think a lot of it has been achieved with the next generations of families who were affected by meeting and coming together, some examples of which I mentioned. And as I say, the truth piece, I think, is there by looking at the archives and looking at the accounts of the people that we're talking about.
Owen, could I ask you a question in relation to the RIC? How do you think the contribution of the RIC should be commemorated?
Well, you see, people get kind of hung up on monuments and memorials, and I'm not necessarily a big fan of these big. I know they're very important for some people. I don't think you have to put up a big plaque or a big monument to people to remember them. I think it would serve us well if we learned more as a society about the role of the RIC, and I think obviously the fact that it has the royal prefix before it, automatically just people assume that it's sort of a no-go area perhaps. But what I can only speak about my experience of researching the RIC in my locality, and I know that I had grown up being told that 5 black and tans were killed at Ballymacandie, and of course when I began to research it, they weren't all black and tans at all. And I think there is a distinction to be made between the auxiliaries and the black and tans on one hand, and what I would call the ordinary rank and file of the RIC. I know they all got caught up in the same conflict with the IRA, and that's difficult for some people to acknowledge this far on. But you know, in looking at the stories of the people that lived in my area who were in the RIC, they were ordinary men who were with ordinary families, living in communities with their neighbours and their friends, and were, broadly speaking, were a reasonably popular police force before the events of the 20th century came around. So I'm not necessarily advocating or suggesting a formal memorial or commemoration, but it's interesting that the only commemoration of the RIC, I think, actually in the last couple of years was in London, when members or descendants were invited over to. I think just in the interest of completeness and in the interest of all the nuances of the period, I think publishing more, learning more, writing more, speaking more about the role of the RIC at this time would be appropriate commemoration, if that's possible.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments to Owen's paper? No. Okay, well then, if I could just remind you that the next event on the programme will be a lecture by our esteemed academic director, Professor Maurice Brick, in the Daniel O'Connell Memorial Church, which is about 15 minutes walk through the town of Cahirsiveen. You can't miss it. So please join us there. For those of you who are online, you can follow the lecture if you Google the Daniel O'Connell Memorial Church, Cahirsiveen, and it will be live broadcast from 3:45 onwards. After the talk in the church, we will adjourn to the St. Mary's Conkeating Memorial Park to listen to Casey O'Driscoll, a distinguished Kerry sportswoman, talk about her career, and that's at 5:15 in St. Mary's. Again, you pass that on the way down to the church on the left-hand side. So please join us there. Now, it just remains for me on my own behalf, on behalf of the committee, on behalf of the audience, to thank Owen for a really excellent presentation for the Daniel O'Connell lecture this year. Thank you very much indeed.